Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight, the road runs below Poitiers, into the country where the Charente cuts a slow green line through pale limestone and low green scrub, where the towns sit up on escarpments of white stone and the vineyards spill down towards the current, and where a family called the Taillefer's had been counts for close to 2 centuries by the moment this story begins. If this story has been good company on a long night, please subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the stories coming, and there are more waiting. Picture this. The honour itself was named for the town, and the town for the ridge above the river. The town itself sits on a broad, flat escarpment of limestone above the channel, with old walls the colour of new bread, and a cathedral church of St. Peter that had been razed, torn down, and raised again in a heavier Romanesque form during the century before Isabella was born. The bell of that cathedral could be heard 3 villages away on a still dawn. Below the town, the Charente ran wide and slow, catching willow shadows and running clear over pale gravel, and along its banks sat the stone farms that fed the county and the stone chapels that guarded its saints. The country around was olive grey in colour rather than green, a country of dry scrub and stunted oak in the higher places, and of hazel and walnut in the low ground near the bank. The land grew grain in the wide fields to the north, and wine in the softer lower slopes. And every autumn, the pressing of the nut oil went on for weeks in the low stone barns, so that even the winter air carried a faint scent of the pressing and hearth smoke. The oil was traded down the stream to the coast, and from the coast it went out to the north and Flanders and Ireland, and in return came northern wool and Flemish cloth, and the ironwork and metalware of the wide valleys of the north. The Taillefer's had been counts of this escarpment and this valley for close to 2 centuries by the last decade of the 1100s. Their name meant, in the old fighting speech of the northern tongue, iron cutter, and it had been earned in some forgotten combat by the first of them. A Vulgrin who had held the county in the 10th century, when the Carolingian kings still ruled Aquitaine in name. Since Vulgrin the line had held the escarpment in an unbroken succession of Williams and Vulgrins and Geoffreys, marrying the daughters of the lords of Perigord and the lords of Auvergne, adding land where they could, holding it stubbornly where they could not add, and above all holding the pale limestone town at their back and the slow current at their feet. The rank of a count of the Angoumois was not the rank of a duke or a sovereign. In the chain of loyalties that ran through Aquitaine, the count held his land of the duke, who by the close of the century was Eleanor, the old lady of 2 crowns. She had married first into the house of the Capets and then into the house of the Angevins, and she had passed her duchy down to her sons, so that the Lord of Angoulême now, in a formal sense, owed his loyalty first to her and then, through her, to the Angevin side of that family. In practice, he did, as counts of the frontier always did. He listened to the closer voice. When a Capetian rider came in force through Aquitaine, the Count of the Escarpment bowed to the crown at Paris. When a rider from across the sea came in force through the province, he bowed to London. In the long lull between, he did as he pleased, which was mostly to press old quarrels against his neighbours, chief among them the Lusignans. The Lusignans were a house of dense castles set on rock outcrops in the country to the northwest, in a stretch of land between Poitiers and La Rochelle, where the fields grew thinner and the stone showed through. They had risen slowly through the century by the ordinary means of ambitious families, which is to say by marriage where possible, and by force where necessary. Their most famous son had gone away to the Holy Land in the last generation, and become for a brief and dazzling season the King of Jerusalem. And although that crown had slipped from the family's hands, the memory of it hung about the Lusignan halls like an old banner. Between the Lusignans and the Taillefer's there had been a border quarrel so old that no one troubled to record its beginnings. The 2 houses grazed cattle on the same disputed pastures, took toll on the same disputed roads, married into the same lesser families. and disagreed, continually, about which of them was the greater power in the country between the two seats. The Lusignan kingship of Jerusalem had been the kingship of Guy, a younger son of the house who had gone east in the years when the small eastern crown still needed men of good sword. He had married a widow of the eastern royal line called Sibylla, and had come to the throne of Jerusalem through her, and had lost the field of Hattin against Saladin in the summer of 1187, and had ended his days as lord of the smaller crown of Cyprus that the Angevin ruler Richard had sold to him on the passage east. Guy's brother Aimery had held Cyprus after him, and had put the family name on two eastern seats in one generation. The remembered strand of that eastern kingship gave the Lusignan halls of Isabella's day a step of dignity above the ordinary lords of the western country, and a certain confidence in the western council chamber that Taillefer of the escarpment had never in his own lifetime particularly wished to marry into. Into the writing chancery, in these decades, went the parchments and the wax seals of the daily rule. The room sat in a stone corner at the back of the residence, and there a chaplain and a scribe maintained the family records, the grants to abbeys, the confirmations of tolls, the letters of alliance to the lords of Perigord and Rochefoucauld, the accounts of the pressing of the oil and the drawing of the wine. Ink was mixed with oak gall and lampblack and gum, and stored in horn pots that rested in a row on a shelf worn smooth by a century of use. The wax for the seals was held in a coffer bound with iron. It was red for common letters and green for grants to the church, and a rare deep blue for the weightier charters that bound the family's honour. The scribe who wrote out these letters wrote them in a slow, careful hand that leaned a little forward, and his inkpot sat beside a window that looked down on the flow above the writing chancery, on the first floor of the residence. Ran a long solar with a fireplace at either end, and beyond it a smaller chamber for the lord and his wife. The head of the family in the last decades of the 1100s, at the moment this story is preparing itself, was a man called Aymer, sometimes styled Taillefer to distinguish him from others of the same name in the land. He was a hard, careful man, not old, not young, patient in advisement and quick in the field, respected by his men and not much loved by his neighbours. Beside him, in the upstairs quarter, lived his lady, who was a woman of a very different kind of family, and it is with her and with the man she had married that the next part of the story properly begins. For the moment it is enough to see the country and the town, the pale limestone escarpment above the slow water, the cathedral bell heard 3 villages off, the fields of grain and the slopes of vine, the aroma of the pressing coming out of the winter barns, the writing office with its horn pots and its red wax, and to know that this was the land into which a girl was about to be born whose marriage would decide, for a full generation, the fate of 2 kingdoms. He had come to his rule through a minor palace dispute, some passages before in the way that a good many lords of these escarpments had come to theirs. An older cousin dead without an heir, an inheritance disputed between 2 branches, a short, sharp period of arm-twisting among the local barons, and then a formal recognition by the Duke of Aquitaine and by the Archbishop of Bordeaux that Taillefer was, in fact, the rightful heir. He had been in his early manhood when he assumed the honour, and he came into it with the settled bearing of a man who had never really doubted that the escarpment and the water would be his. He was a lean man, dark of hair and steady of eye, careful with his money in the way that a lord of a frontier country has to be careful, and skilled in the practical arts of his station. The reading of a charter, the drawing of a wine tally, the disposition of men on a road, the finding of a good horse in a market. He was said to prefer the terrain of the vineyards to the flat wide fields, and to maintain in the stone lodge above his sunward vines a set of stiller chambers where he retreated in the harvest months. His men said of him that he was slow to anger and thorough when angered. His enemies said of him that he was slow to give and thorough when he gave nothing. For his wife he had married, in a match arranged some passages before Isabella's birth, a woman whose blood was worth more to a frontier lord than the entire Charente Valley put together. Her name was Alice, and she was of the House of Courtenay. To understand the weight of that name, the story has to turn its head briefly north towards the region around Paris, where the castle of Courtenay stood on its river, and where the family that took its name from that castle had, in the century before, married so cleverly that a strand of Capetian blood ran in every one of them. Alice's father was Peter of Courtenay, and Peter's father in turn had been a son of the sixth Capetian sovereign of that lineage. This meant that Alice was a great-granddaughter of a crowned capet, and that her brothers held the sort of steady weight in a Paris consultation that such kin enjoys, never quite a claimant, never quite forgotten. One of her brothers would in due course wed a woman with a claim to Constantinople and become, for a brief strange season, an emperor in the Latin East. Another would remain a lord of scattered holds in the Ile-de-France, and a counsellor to the crown on the Seine. Alice herself was not raised to expect a throne of any kind. She was reared to be wedded for her lineage to a man whose house needed it, and the man given her was Aymer. What such a match meant for a county on the Angoumois escarpment was harder to weigh than the wax on the parchment suggested. The union gave a spouse whose kin sat inside the closest consultations at Paris, and it carried with her the practical uses of such a connection, a route by which a border count could complain over the head of his own duke, a friendly correspondence with the chancery on the Ile-de-France, a shred of the great blood inside the child that would in time inherit. It also produced a subtle problem. The Angoumois held its land of Eleanor, and beyond her of the crowned house across the sea, and to import a countess of that particular strain was to place a small strain over the ordinary line of vassalage that ran through Aquitaine. In the writing office below the upstairs quarter, the scribe learned to write two forms of the countess's style, a fuller one for dispatches carried up the Loire, and a plainer one for letters that went west to Bordeaux or beyond the Channel, and the wax used on each was chosen with equal care. Aymer's rank at Bordeaux rose by a measurable step. His standing among the neighbouring escarpment lords rose by more. The Lusignans, who had always assumed that a Taillefer bride came out of the ordinary pool of Périgord and Limousin heiresses, adjusted their pretensions accordingly, and their border quarrels with the Charente took on a more careful phrasing in the decade that followed. For Aymer, the match had been the making of him. The royal strain he had married put him on a different footing with Philip of France than any of his ancestors had enjoyed. It also put him at a subtle angle to his own overlord, the Duke of Aquitaine, and above the Duke, the ruler across the Channel, because a lady of that northern lineage was one whose loyalties could be pulled two ways, if ever the day came when the two crowns decided to pull. In his own chancery, the scribe who wrote out his letters was careful to grant the countess her full Capetian style whenever a dispatch went out to a northern seat, and used a plainer form when one went to a Channel one. Alice arrived with a following that surprised the plain hearth-tenders of the escarpment. She had come south, from the country of the Ile-de-France, with two of her own women, a chaplain who read the Latin with a slightly different weight than the Angoumois chaplains read theirs, a clerk of accounts, and a coffer of books. The books were the ones a woman of her family carried with her into a strange country, a psalter with painted margins, a book of hours in Latin, a life of St. Louis of Bourges written out in a good clear hand, a book of the moralities in vernacular verse. The trunk travelled with her wherever she went in the district, and rested, when she was at home, in her upper quarter above the writing chancery, next to a window that looked out on the valley. She was not a woman who made a noise in a wide chamber. Her women said of her that she kept her opinions until her husband asked for them, and then gave them all at once, with the effect of a still blade. She was said to have insisted, in the first year of her marriage, on the enlarging of the ladies' oratory in the residence, and on the placing there of a small altar of the Virgin, which she paid for out of her own dower. She rode when the country was quiet, and did not ride when it was not. She kept her chaplain close. The Count and Countess had, in their early years, made the customary pilgrimages that a prominent couple made in their lands to the shrine of Saint Cybard on the escarpment, to the little basilica at Orbeterre, carved directly into the limestone cliff, to the Abbey of La Couronne, where the Taillefer's had endowed a chantry. On these journeys they rode side by side on quiet horses, and at each shrine they gave what the archdeacon had suggested was proper, which was neither too much to look like fear, nor too little to look like meanness. In this, as in most things, the Lord did what his lady had thought about in advance. 2 little girls were born to them in the early passage of the marriage. Both died in the cradle, in that plain and terrible fashion of the 12th century, where a good breath at Compline turned into a fever at Matins, and a covered face by the 3rd day. Their names were not much recorded. Their father had them buried in the cathedral above the Charente, in a slot in the wall, and it was after the second of these burials that a run of 2 winters went by without a further pregnancy. And Alice made a longer pilgrimage into the country of her own family, to a shrine of the Virgin outside the seat at Paris, and returned. In the following season, a 3rd baby was carried, and this one, at last, was carried to term. It was a girl. The name bestowed on her was Isabella, which Alice's own mother had borne, and which had come into the Capetian family from Iberia a generation before. She was baptized in the cathedral, with the Archbishop of Bordeaux himself acting as godfather at a private ceremony, and she was carried afterwards into the upstairs quarter, above the writing chancery, and laid in a cradle of oak. It was, so far as the scriptorium recorded it, the year 1188, or perhaps a season later. No one at the moment thought it important enough to write down exactly, because girls' births rarely were, and because the upper quarter had not yet recognized that the infant in the oak cradle was in fact an only surviving heir. For that would require another passage of Alice's quiet pilgrimages, and then another, until by her 5th spring it had become plain in the writing chancery, and unspoken, but understood everywhere in the surrounding fields, that no son was going to come. The Courtenay line in the mother's coffer had done its diplomatic work in her husband's dispatches and its private work in his prayers, and had produced in the end exactly 1 surviving daughter, and that daughter was the small girl in the oak cradle. The Charente honour, in the closing decades of the 1100s, had its heiress. The upper quarter, above the writing chancery, in her ancestral residence, was the space in which she spent the first passages of her life. It was not a large one, and by the standard of the wide northern chambers she would later live in, it was almost plain. Its walls had been plastered smooth and whitewashed with a lime wash that had a faint blue tint from the ashes the plasterers had used, and along the wall opposite the window ran a low-painted band of red and green that had been added by an itinerant painter in Alice's first season in her new home. A wooden bench with a woolen cushion sat under the window. A tall painted coffer with iron corners rested against the interior wall. A fireplace at the northern end held the space warm from October to April. Above the hearth hung a painted wooden panel of the Virgin and the small Christ, with a red curtain that could be drawn across it in length. The oak cradle in which Isabella had been laid at her baptism sat, in her first months, at the foot of her mother's bed, and it was rocked by a nurse who had been chosen from the daughters of a modest manor below the city. The nurse's name was Mahout, and she was a stout, patient young woman, with strong arms and a good singing voice, who had lost her own infant a month before Isabella's birth, and had come up to the residence out of a mixture of grief and hunger and duty. She grew fond of the baby in the cradle at once, and she remained in her lady's service until Isabella was well past the age of a usual nurse's charge. The residence, as the girl first knew it, was a place with 3 distinct kinds of hours. There was the hour of the morning offices, when Alice and her ladies went down the corridor to the chapel, and the choir of chaplains sang the psalms in a rehearsed voice. And there was the hour of the day's business, when Ima sat in the wide space below, and the scribe carried in the parchments, and the steward set out the accounts, and the marshal reported the disposition of men on the highways. And there was the hour of the evening, when Ima and Alice withdrew upstairs and ate a plain supper with 2 or 3 of their intimates, and the fire was allowed to burn low, and someone read out loud from a book. Into these 3 kinds of hours the infant moved as any young girl moved in a well-run establishment of the age. At daybreak she went with Mahout to a corner of the chapel where her mother had put a low cushion for her, and there she listened to the offices without understanding them, and looked up at the sanctuary image. In the day's business she stayed upstairs, at first in the cradle, then in a low wicker chair, then on a low stool at Mahout's knee. In the evenings she was carried down for the reading by candlelight, and set on Alice's lap at first, and later on a cushion beside her. And she listened to the moralities in verse, and the quieter psalms, and the parts of the life of St. Louis of Bourges that were suitable for young ears. When the girl was old enough to walk, Alice set aside a piece of the domestic sanctuary for her. Her parent believed, as her own parent had believed, that a daughter of a prominent house ought to be handed a piece of the daily religion to keep on her own, a pious task that was hers, not the household's. In her case it was the changing of the lights at the sanctuary image. Every day, at a set hour in the middle of the forenoon, Mahout would fetch a fresh bundle of thin beeswax candles from the chandler's box, and the girl would carry them, holding them carefully in both hands, from the painted press in the corridor to the place before the sanctuary. There she would take down the old ones and put up the new, and Alice would come and wait beside her, and then walk with her back to the upstairs quarter. This exercise gave the girl her first Latin. Alice taught her the psalm. The household's chaplains sang most often at the middle hour of the forenoon, Beatus vir qui non abba, and drilled it into her over a few weeks, a phrase per session, until she could say it in a clear, steady voice with the correct pauses. It was not the Latin of a scholar, it was the Latin of a daughter of a prominent house. The Latin needed to say the offices, the Latin needed to read a psalter, the Latin needed to write a letter to a bishop, and no more. When she was of an age to sit at a writing desk, Alice had a slender psalter made for her, on parchment fine enough to be doubled over, with margins painted in the same red and green as the band on the wall of the upstairs quarter. It stayed on the desk in her mother's suite, and was moved with the chamber staff when they went from the escarpment up to the lodge above the vineyards for the warmer months. Ima, for his part, treated the daughter of the house with the amused, mild courtesy that a soldier of that age treated any young charge who was not yet a boy or a bride. He set her on his knee when he was at ease in the upstairs quarter and told her the names of horses. He sent her, when she was 5 or 6, a pair of riding shoes made to a child's foot, and had her led out on a fat old mare into the courtyard, and watched with a pleased mouth while Mahout walked at her stirrup. He gave her, on the feast of St. Peter, a plain silver cross that had come out of his own baptism, and Mahout hung it round her neck. Between these small gifts and small ceremonies, a plan was being shaped for the child. Ima began, in the manner of border lords who understood their trade, to write to the Duke of Aquitaine about the honour due to a daughter who would inherit, and to the Archbishop of Bordeaux about the marriage a considerable honour of the land would require, and to the Lusignans across the border about the possibility of a conference at Christmas. By the time the child was old enough to understand that the word heiress meant something more than the name of a girl in a story, the arrangements were already being made. She was 6, then 7, then 8. She learned to read the Latin of her psalter aloud without stumbling. She sat with her mother and her mother's women at the embroidery frame and pushed a needle through a piece of white linen. She was set, once a week, to sit for an hour in her mother's receiving room while envoys came in and knelt and gave letters, and Alice would put a hand on the child's shoulder and let her see, without saying anything about it, that a well-born lady sat and watched and did not speak until it was time. Her childhood passed in this pattern: the pale limestone of the height above the water, the scent of the pressing in autumn, the offices of the chapel at daybreak, the reading of the moralities in the evening, the silver cross under her linen shift. Cooked apples, softened with butter and honey, were her favourite food, and Mahout set aside a dish of them in the upstairs quarter through the winter. Come July, the household went up to the paved lodge above the vineyards, and she slept in a small chamber with a window looking down through the terraces to the vines, and she watched the swifts wheel over the town at dusk. She was, as the household understood, a beautiful girl. Not merely a pretty one. Every well-fed daughter of a prominent house is pretty at 7, but a beautiful one, with a shape of face and a colour of eye that made the old women of the district pause when they saw her and then say, more softly than they had meant to, that she would be a trouble to whoever had the raising of her. Alice heard the remark and did not repeat it. The Count heard the remark and did not repeat it. They both understood, as everyone in the district understood, that a beautiful heiress of a frontier land in the closing decades of the 1100s was worth, in cold coin, more than the whole of the oil trade for a decade. And they both grasped, as everyone in the district grasped, that within a season or two someone would come to fetch her. The lord who came to fetch her, in the first sense of that word, was Hugh of Lusignan, called Hugh le Brun, which meant Hugh the Brown, for the colour of his hair rather than the colour of his eye. He was the head of the Lusignan house, at the end of the 1100s, a man in his early 30s when the betrothal was arranged, a man of the dense castles and the disputed pastures and the memory of a kingship in Jerusalem, a man of the very family with which the Taillefers had been quarrelling for several generations. For that reason, the betrothal, when it was proposed, was received in her father's district with a certain considered surprise. The old border quarrel had been the shape of the last several counts' lives, that the Lord of Angoulême, of all people, should agree to marry his only daughter into the Lusignan establishment was a piece of statecraft that took some digesting. The Archbishop of Bordeaux, when the news was carried to him, is said to have paused in the middle of dictating a letter and remarked to his secretary that either the Count had grown very tired of small wars or he had grown very afraid of a bigger one. Both things were, in a plain sense, true. Isabella's father had grown tired of the small wars, which had been going on for so long that the disputed pastures no longer had a real value to either side, and he had grown afraid of a bigger one, which was the shape of the coming reign of Richard of England. Richard was the Duke of Aquitaine, as well as the sovereign across the sea, and he was a man who did not like these frontier disputes of his southern vassals to eat into the strength of his overlordship. The Count had heard, before the betrothal was proposed, that Richard was thinking of a heavy hand in Aquitaine, and he had decided, in the careful way he decided everything, that a match into the Lusignan house would put the frontier quiet and free him to sit on the same side of the Duke's chamber as Hugh le Brun. Hugh, for his part, wanted her father's honour itself. He wanted it because it was a rich territory, because of the wine and the pressed oil and the escarpment above the Charente, and because, through his own mother, who had been a lesser Taillefer, he already carried in his blood a thread of the local claim. He knew he could not win the land in war. He knew he could win it through Isabella, and he was willing, in return, to bring his half of the border into the marriage as her dower. The dowry itself was the shape of a stream running two ways at once. On the Angoumois side, the Count was giving up a daughter and receiving in exchange the promise that the Lusignan castles along his seaward border would not be turned against his revenues or his toll roads, and that his own honour, in the fullness of time, would be governed by a lord who had already married into it. On the Lusignan side, Hugh was giving up his bachelorhood and taking in exchange a claim upon the escarpment that no war of his father's had ever been able to force. What the marriage did, in the plain economic sense, was to consolidate two neighbouring vineyard economies under one administration, to remove the disputed pastures from the account books of both parties, and to place the country between the two seats under a single toll regime. In Poitou, where the leading barons had for 2 generations been sorting themselves into Angevin and Capetian allegiances along the lines of marriage and revenue, the union of the Charentay and Lusignan honours would mean that one further piece of the Atlantic map had committed itself to the older loyalty. Duke Richard, before his death at the small siege in the Limousin, had been made aware of the arrangement and had given it his ducal consent, and it was this consent, in the parchment sealed at Poitiers in the year of the agreement, that Hugh's chaplain would later carry north to Paris in the autumn of the new century as one of the exhibits attached to his appeal. The negotiation went on for months. Aymer wrote letters to the Archbishop of Bordeaux and to the ducal court of Aquitaine, holding the overlord informed of each stage of the progress, and he sent envoys north to Couhé, where Hugh Le Brun held his court. Hugh sent his own envoys back in return. The wax on the letters that passed between the two seats was the deep blue that the Charentay writing chancery reserved for the important charters, and by the middle of the year 1198, the terms had been settled. Isabella was 10, Hugh was 30-something. The gap of ages did not, at the moment, strike anyone as a matter for particular remark. A prominent honour of the country was expected to marry the head of another prominent honour. His age was what it was, and the girl's age was what it was, and the marriage would, in the usual way, not be made complete until the girl was 13 or 14. In the meantime, she was to be sent, in the first instance, to her betrothed's own establishment, to be raised there among his kin, and to grow into the woman she would one day be, as his wife. This last provision was in fact the customary shape of a leading dynastic engagement. The girl of one house went to live within the walls of the other, learned its manners and its saints, absorbed its cooking and its accent, and grew, over a slow 4 or 5 seasons of maturing, from a stranger into a wife who was already at home when the wedding came. Alice had done something of the same, in her Courtenay girlhood, when she was sent for a period to the French court. So too had Aymer's own mother. It was the way well-born girls were made ready. Alice received the plan with the sort of steady composure she received every plan of her husband's. She approved. In her own inner suite, she began the customary preparations. She had the chandler make up a coffer of good beeswax candles for the domestic sanctuary Isabella would retain in her new home. She had the seamstress lengthen the girl's linen. She had the goldsmith of the town make a plain circlet, plainer than a wedding circlet, but heavier than a common girl's fillet, and had it put in the coffer. She had her scribe copy out a set of the Psalms in a hand, a little larger than the one in Isabella's own slender psalter, so that the girl could read them by firelight in a strange chamber. She had a plain cross of silver twin to the one Isabella already wore, made and put in the casket as a spare, the bride's coffer. When it was closed for its ride north to Couhé, was a heavy oak trunk bound with iron and lined with a red woolen cloth, and inside it were folded her linens, her over-tunics, her one mantle of a dark red wool, her 3 veils, her psalter and her book of hours, her 2 silver crosses, her silver spoon, a comb of boxwood, and a little box of dried lavender and rue from Alice's own herb garden to hold the linen sweet. The trunk sat, for the last 3 days before its journey, in the upstairs quarter above the writing chancery, and Alice would come into the space at odd hours and lift the lid and remain a while and look at what she had put in, and close the lid again without adding to or drawing from the contents. Aymer also had a piece of Isabella's baggage to prepare. He had in his stables a pale grey mare of a still coat, that he judged the right horse for the ride. He had the harness drawn out and re-oiled with a fresh mixture of neat's foot oil and hearth ash, so that the leather carried the scent of a saddler's shop for a week. He had a saddle cloth of dark red wool made new. He had, for the mare's bridle, a set of thin pieces of tinned copper hung on the cheek pieces, so that the harness would jingle prettily on the road and let anyone at a farm gate see that a well-set young rider rode by. He also had, as frontier lords did, a plan for the return of Isabella, if matters went wrong. A discreet party of Angoumois men would ride north with the girl. They would stay at Couhay as long as courtesy demanded, and no longer two of Ima's most trusted household officers, a knight called Guillaume of Lignac and a chaplain called Bernard, who had been familiar with Isabella since she was in the cradle, would remain there as her escort and her tie to home. If, in the 4 or 5 winters before the marriage was made complete, any part of the agreement was broken by the Lusignan side, Guillaume and Bernard were to bring the girl back again. It was in the July of 1199, Isabella 11, nearing the marrying age, that the ride was made. Hugh le Brun, at Couhay, sent an escort of his own knights to fetch her. The girl was set on the pale grey mare, in a riding cloak of dark red wool with a hood, and Alice held her stirrup for a moment and gave her a piece of honey cake wrapped in a linen cloth to eat on the road. Her father kissed her forehead. Mahat walked beside her horse for the first mile out of the town, and then handed her rein to a groom and stood at the roadside and watched the party out of sight. The bride's coffer went by an ox cart behind the candles for the domestic sanctuary at Couhay, the psalter with the larger hand, the 2 silver crosses, the little box of dried lavender and rue, the pale grey mare with its new red saddlecloth, the 2 Angoumois men-at-arms riding at her shoulder, the chaplain Bernard on a still cob behind. The Lusignan escort spread out fore and aft. The dust of the summer road went up behind the party, as far as Alice could see, standing at the town gate with her women. And so the girl of the pale limestone escarpment went out of her own home into a strange country to be made over the slow 4 years to come into a Lusignan wife. Also, at any rate, the plan of that July had it. The plan of that August of 1199 did not survive the following July. In the year between the ride north and the arrival of a very different party at the same seat, 3 considerable events had happened in the wider world. The old Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor, still writing her steady letters from Fontevraud, had made a long, slow progress through her province to settle the loyalty of her southern vassals. Richard of England had been killed by a stray crossbow bolt at a small siege in the Limousin, and the throne of England and the Duchy of Aquitaine had passed to his younger brother John, and John had ridden south to Aquitaine to receive the homage of the major honours of the ducal lands and to see, in his own way, what he had inherited. John was a man of 32 or thereabouts when he came down into Aquitaine in the warm months of the new century's opening year. He was small of stature by the measure of his brothers, dark of hair and clean-shaven where his brothers had gone bearded, quick of speech and quick of temper, sharp in a legal argument and prone to sudden displays of Angevin generosity that were as abrupt and as reckless as the tempers they usually followed. His father had been the imposing Henry of England, the maker of an empire. His mother was Eleanor. His elder brothers had all been in their turns, the shining hope of the family, and each had turned out badly. John had grown up as the youngest, the neglected one, the one the old chroniclers said had been called Lackland, because at his birth there had been no fief left to give him. Now he had the lot, all of it, the empire that ran from the Cheviot in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. He was riding it, as a man rides a horse he does not yet quite know. He came to Aquitaine that season in the company of his mother and a company of lords from Poitou. and he made his slow round of the halls of his Aquitanian vassals. He was, on this progress, at his most careful. He listened, he distributed grants, he kissed the daughters of the leading families, and set them on his knee for the length of a psalm. He passed on. In the middle of July he came to the Charente honour, and the lord of the country rode out to meet him. And John spent 3 nights in the residence, on the limestone escarpment above the tidal reach. It was in those 3 nights that the interruption happened. What John saw at his host's residence has been told and retold in various ways in the century after. In the plainest telling, Taillefer received him below, and Alice received him in her private quarter, and the household spread its best cloth, and set out its Angevin gold plate pieces she had inherited through her Courtenay grandmother from an aunt at the court on the Seine, and sang the guest in with all the honour due to a ruler. And in some part of those 3 days, John saw Isabella. She had come back from her betrothed's establishment for a few weeks that warm season, so that her mother could see her, and she was in Alice's suite while John was in the lower audience space. Her parents brought her out at some steady moment to greet the visitor. She was still shy of her 12th year. She was slender, brown of hair, grey of eye, with a face that made the old women pause. She wore, that afternoon, a pale blue tunic that Alice had ordered cut for the warm season, and a white linen veil pinned back with a plain silver pin, and the silver cross of her infancy on a chain under her collar. She curtsied to the visitor in the manner she had been taught. She did not speak until spoken to. She spoke, when spoken to, in a low, steady voice that had the country's accent under it. John looked at her once, and then looked at her again, and then said quite lightly some ordinary thing, something about the height of her, or the colour of her tunic, and Isabella made the answer she had been taught. And then her mother drew her gently away and sent her back to her own chamber. That was what John saw. What he did with it was in the plain way what an Angevin ruler did with a matter when he had decided to have it. He rode on 2 days later, and by the time the Count was helping his royal guest back into the saddle at the town gate, John had already begun to arrange, in his own head, how he would take the girl. He had, at the moment of taking her, a wife. He had married some years before, an heiress from across the sea, called Isabella of Gloucester, a distant cousin whom he had married for her lands. The marriage had been childless and quietly unhappy, and John had already been thinking, without much heat, about setting it aside on the grounds of consanguinity, the standard door through which noble husbands of the age walked when they wanted a new wife. Now in his mind as he rode away, the door was a purpose. He would set aside the Gloucester wife. He would take the Angoumois girl. The plan was, in Angevin terms, a good one. Isabella brought with her honour, which sat on the main road between Poitiers and Bordeaux, and which no Angevin sovereign had ever quite been able to bring inside the duchy's obedience. If John married her, he would have that territory in his hand for a lifetime. He would end the border quarrel with his neighbours at a stroke, because they could hardly go on quarrelling with a land that was in effect his own. And he would put a stop to the growing strength of Hugh Le Brun himself, who had been building himself by the very Angoumois betrothal into a rival to the throne of Aquitaine. It was, of course, a plan that ignored one plain human fact and one large legal one. That human fact was that Isabella was already promised, on the honour of her father and on the honour of her mother and on the wax of the deep blue matrix, to Hugh Le Brun. The large legal one was that under the customs of the Duchy of Aquitaine, a marriage pledge sealed on that deep blue wax was a marriage in law, and that the taking away of such a wife was, in the plain formal language of the duchy, a breach of the peace against her betrothed lord. The betrothal of a girl of Isabella's rank was not, in that century, a private family arrangement. It was, in the eyes of the canon and civil law, both a public covenant sealed before the church and witnessed by the officials of the province, and its breach ran into every branch of the two laws at once. The third Lateran Council of 1179 had ruled on the sanctity of a betrothal in language. The Aquitanian bishops kept close at hand. The provincial councils of the Seaward Church had ruled the same. The Angevin custom of the Duchy of Aquitaine, set out in the Assizes Richard had promulgated in his own southern years, gave a wronged betrothed lord the specific remedy of an appeal to the ducal court, and, if the ducal court proved inadequate to the case, to the overlord of those ducal lands above. What John had done in the 3 summer days at the escarpment was not the taking of a bride whose family had no chance to say otherwise. The Count's consent had been given, and given willingly. What he had done was to take a bride whose betrothed remained legally in the field, against whose interest no compensation had been offered, and whose appeal to a higher court no anointed prince could lawfully close. It was into this precise legal gap that Hugh's chaplain would step in the autumn following the Angoulême wedding, with a parchment case drawn to the exact measure of the older duchy's own procedures. John did not, at that moment, weigh the fact or the law. He rode south to Bordeaux. He sent a chaplain back to Angoulême with a letter under his own signet. He wrote to his own bishops across the sea to prepare the setting aside of the Gloucester consort. He wrote to the Archbishop of Bordeaux to prepare the wedding. And he wrote to the Count. In the plain wide hand, a ruler used to his vassals, a message that has not been kept, but whose substance is entirely clear. The letter offered a bargain. The bargain was this: John would take Isabella to wife. The Count, who had come reluctantly to the Lusignan betrothal in the first place, would be a father-in-law to the sovereign across the sea and Duke of Aquitaine, and would keep, as his own life-lord, his ancestral honour, rather than see it slip in a slow drift into another family's hands. Alice, whose Courtenay blood would go into the wife of a crowned prince, would rise in her own reckoning by a full step. Her father's line, in short, would gain everything the Lusignan match had promised and more, and lose only the Lusignan match itself. The Count read the letter in the upstairs quarter above his writing office, with Alice standing at his shoulder. He did not speak for some time. He read it a second time. He said in the end one short sentence to the chaplain who had brought it, a sentence that has come down in a chronicle from Lusignan lands in a slightly polished form, but whose meaning is plain enough. He said that he would think on it and would send his answer within a week. And then he sent the messenger to his own kitchens for a supper. Within the week, the answer had been made. The parents had accepted John's offer. In the writing chancery below the upstairs quarter, on a piece of parchment sealed with the deep blue wax that had been used for the Poitou Charter only a season before, the Count's scribe drew up his consent to a wedding of his daughter to John at the earliest possible date and at whatever place in the duchy his future son-in-law might choose. A rider was sent north to fetch Isabella home, and in the last week of July, a girl not yet at her marrying year, on the same pale grey mare, in the same dark red riding cloak, rode back down through the harvest dust to the settlement on the limestone escarpment above the slow current, into an establishment that had, in a fortnight, unmade one betrothal and made another. The wedding was fixed for the 24th of August of that year at Bordeaux, and the preparations that filled the remaining weeks of that hot season were of a different order from the quiet packing of the bridal coffer that had been prepared for the Lusignan establishment. That coffer had been a mother's careful work, measured to the size of a girl's life in a modest seat to the north. The preparations for the wedding of a royal wife were the work of a dozen households at once. The Archbishop of Bordeaux and his chapter, her paternal residence on the escarpment, John's own travelling company, moving its tents and its kitchens down from Poitiers. The port of Bordeaux, with its ships and its merchants watching a royal progress come down to the Garonne. The Count rode ahead to Bordeaux with a close affinity of his best knights and his writing office scribe, and his chaplain Bernard, who had been at Isabella's baptism and had ridden with her north the year before. Alice remained at home for the first part of the preparations, overseeing the making of Isabella's wedding gown and the cutting of the mantle that would go over it. The gown was made of a fine twill of local wool that had been taken up to Limoges to be dyed a deep ivory, almost the colour of new cream, and over it the mantle was cut from a bolt of silk in the deep red that the Taillefer family had always used on its important occasions. It was lined with a narrow band of miniver at the throat, in the manner of the prominent southern ladies, and it was clasped at the breast with a pin of gold that Taillefer had sent from Bordeaux by his fastest rider. Alice sat with her two best seamstresses every evening in the upper chamber, and oversaw each piece by candlelight. And when she was satisfied, she had each piece folded in its own sleeve of linen and laid flat in the large chest that would travel to Bordeaux on the cart. Isabella was brought to Bordeaux 5 days before the ceremony. She came with her mother and a train of women. The pale grey mare replaced by a taller bay horse, more suitable to a bride. The journey south from her home to the city on the Garonne took 2 days at a gentle pace, riding through the dry grey-green landscape of the Entre-deux-Mers, past the paved chapels of the Benedictine priories and through the vineyards already heavy with the late summer grapes, until on the second afternoon the riders came over the last low rise and saw Bordeaux below them. The wide curve of the Garonne brown and slow, the quays with their wine ships moored 3 and 4 deep, the cathedral spire above the rooftops. In Bordeaux, Isabella was lodged in the Archbishop's palace in a set of chambers that had been prepared for her, with fresh rushes and a new linen hanging on the wall of the sleeping quarter, and an iron brazier already lit against the evening chill that came off the water. Her women were lodged in the spaces adjacent. Alice came and sat with her on the evening before the wedding and talked to her, in the private and unhurried manner she had always used with the child, about the shape of the ceremony to come, the vows, the ring, the high mass, the giving of the ring, the Archbishop's words. Isabella sat on a low stool at her mother's feet, with her hands in her lap, as she had always sat for the evening reading in the upstairs quarters at home. And she listened, and she asked 1 or 2 questions in a low voice, and Alice answered them in the same low voice, and then she kissed the child's forehead and sent her to bed. The wedding took place in the Cathedral Church of Bordeaux, in the long nave, with the Archbishop officiating and Taillefer giving his daughter's hand. John stood at the altar already in his wedding clothes, a mantle of red samite clasped at the shoulder, the diadem of the realm not on his head for the ceremony, but carried before him by his steward. He had a gift of earrings for the bride, and a ring of heavy Angevin metal with a red garnet, which had been made by the local goldsmith in the 2 weeks between the summons and the ceremony. Isabella came in on her father's arm in the ivory gown and the deep red mantle, with her hair loose as a bride's was worn, falling past her shoulders, and her 2 silver crosses on their chains, and the new earrings already in her ears. She was small beside her father, and smaller beside her groom. She gave her hand and said her words in the correct order, in a voice that carried as far as the 3rd row of the nave, without trembling. After the ceremony there was a feast in the Archbishop's palace of 3 courses, and the hall was filled with the wine of the Garonne and the smell of the roasted meats and the beeswax of many candles. Taillefer sat at the sovereign's left hand and was given the seat of the first vassal, which was the seat he had earned by the wedding. Alice sat across the table from him with her courtenay composure intact. Isabella sat beside her husband, in a high-backed chair that had been brought from the Archbishop's private quarters and padded with a cushion of red wool. She ate the food that was set before her and drank the wine the steward poured very sparingly, and John spoke to her between courses, and she answered in the steady manner she had been trained to. And when the feast was over, she was taken back to her chambers by her women. The crossing to her new realm did not come immediately. In the weeks after the wedding, the new consort's establishment, the women she would take with her, the coffers and the carts, the provision of horses, the writing of the dispatches that a royal wife sends ahead of herself to prepare her passage, had to be assembled. John was not a patient man in ordinary circumstances, but he was a careful one when the stakes were clear. And he understood that a wife who arrived in her adopted realm with a following that had been badly assembled would be a bride who began at a disadvantage. He gave instructions from his headquarters at Bordeaux, and his marshals carried them out. And by the end of September, the party was ready. The mantle that had been made at home was refolded in its linen sleeve and laid at the top of the large trunk, which was now one of 6 trunks and 2 coffers that made up the bride's personal baggage. Isabella had acquired, in the month at Bordeaux, 3 new gowns, 2 new mantles, a set of fine linen headcloths, a silver comb set with a tiny carnelian, a missal bound in white calfskin with a clasp of silver, a gift from the Archbishop, and a heavy gold chain that John had offered her in the 2nd week of the marriage. Alice added to the coffer before it was locked a bunch of dried rosemary from the garden of the palace, and a letter in her own hand that is not preserved. The party rode north and west from Bordeaux to the coast, through the long flat pine forests of the Landes, and then along the estuary of the Gironde to the port of Blaye, where the ships were waiting. It was October when they came to the coast. The sky above the estuary was a low grey, and the wind coming in off the sea was the first real wind of autumn, smelling of salt and of the tar that had been freshly run along the waterline of the royal ships. The vessels were moored at the quay at Blaye, with their banners already flying, the lions of the northern realm on red, snapping in the wet wind. The stevedores had been loading the baggage since before dawn. Isabella had not seen the sea before. Her own land was inland, and neither of her parents had made the journey to the coast in the years of her childhood. She saw it now from the back of her horse, standing at the top of the quay above the brown estuary current, not the open sea, but the wide mouth of the tidal channel with the sea beyond it, the horizon grey and flat, and said nothing about it. Her women noted, afterwards, that she had looked at the flow for a long moment without expression, and then turned her horse to follow her husband's party down the quay. The passage itself took 2 days, in the ordinary manner of a crossing, when the winds were not harsh. Isabella's cabin on the ship was hung with a red woolen cloth and furnished with a narrow bed and a locked coffer for the valuable pieces of the baggage. She sat on the bed for a part of the first day and watched the swell through the glazed porthole the ship had on its weather side. And in the morning of the 2nd day came up on deck and stood at the rail and watched the white cliffs of the northern shore come up out of the grey sea, chalk white, sharp-edged, nothing like the pale limestone of her home valley. She came ashore in her new realm in October of that year, as the wife of a kingdom whose speech she had a few words of and whose sky was lower and greyer than anything she had seen in Aquitaine. Her women pressed close about her. The escort's forward outriders were already a mile up the road, banners going in and out of the elm cover as their horses rounded the first bend. Underfoot, the quay boards were slick with the drizzle that had begun before dawn, and the ropes coming through the pulleys at the ship's rail made the same wet slap she had heard on the Gironde barges when the wine was loading. The stevedores called to each other in a speech she could not follow, all vowels and edges, sea-flattened. Rooks scattered from a stand of oak inland as the escort mounted. The white cliffs behind her paled into the fog rising off the tidal reach, and the salt scent of the sea went with her, a good half-mile inland before the elm trees closed around the way, and the wind dropped. The road to Winchester went north and west from the coast, through country that was greener than anything she had yet seen. The heavy October green of the downland, the grass almost blue in the autumn air, the flintstone churches in their churchyards, the round-shouldered hills without much timber on them, the sheep tracks running between. It took several days at the pace of a royal progress. Each night the party stopped at a wide hall or a priory, and Isabella's sleeping quarter was prepared in the same manner. Fresh rushes, a hanging of some kind on the wall, the iron brazier lit, the locked coffer placed at the foot of the bed. Her women combed her hair and dressed her in the mornings, and she came out to eat at her husband's table and watched and listened. Winchester was the oldest of the royal residences on the island, older than Westminster, older in its associations with the crown than anywhere north of the Alps, and the wide audience space there was where Isabella was received as consort. It was built in heavy stone, with thick walls and narrow windows, and the roof was hung with the shields of the realm's knights, which rattled in the draught from the doors. The floor was tiled in a pattern of green and amber squares. Candles on stands of iron put a warm glow into the far corners. The scent of the interior was the aroma of rushes and wood smoke and the faint old sweetness of many decades of feasting. Not the pressed oil fragrance of her homeland, not the salt wind of the estuary, but an odour older and heavier. The tang of a realm built in stone on a grey island at the edge of the sea. Isabella received the staff of Winchester in the wide audience space. The chamberlain and the steward knelt. The staff women came and curtsied, and the oldest of them, a woman of the north who had served the previous consort in Eleanor's day, came forward and spoke to the new bride in a northern speech, and Isabella answered in her Angoumois tongue. And the two of them looked at each other a moment with the slight tact of two women who have recognized that they will need to find a way to work together. The elder woman had been the keeper of the linen candlesticks and medicine coffer for 30 seasons. She granted a second, smaller curtsy. Isabella returned the same steady answer she had proffered to the Archbishop of Bordeaux and to the Knight of Angoulême at the stirrup. The staff was received. The coronation was 3 weeks away. In those 3 weeks, Isabella's apartments at Winchester were dressed in the manner of a consort's chambers. The furniture from the royal stores brought in, the hangings put up, the locked coffers placed and opened, and their contents set out. The missal from the Archbishop of Bordeaux went on the prayer desk in the little oratory off the sleeping quarter. The psalter with Alice's larger hand went on the writing table. The silver comb and the silver crosses went in the locked box the chamberlain had provided. The rosemary from Bordeaux went in a dish of warm water on the windowsill, and for a few days it gave the interior a smell that was briefly the smell of the south. It was on the 8th day of October, in the year 1200, that Isabella was crowned consort in the Abbey Church of Westminster. The party rode from Winchester to London in 3 days, through the October rains of the English Midlands, with the roads churned by the horses and the baggage carts and the escort of knights. And they came into London from the south in the afternoon of a day of broken cloud and pale autumn sunlight. Westminster was not London proper, but a sister settlement, a mile to the west, on a loop of the Thames, and the Abbey Church there was the place where the English sovereigns had been crowned since the time of Edward the Confessor, the saint whose bones lay in the shrine behind the high altar. The abbey was filled, on the dawn of the 8th of October, with the aroma of beeswax and chrism. The candles in the nave were so numerous that the light they threw was almost the light of a clouded afternoon, even in the early morning. The floor of the abbey was ancient paving, worn by the feet of 2 centuries of worshippers into a surface as smooth as river gravel, and the cold of the flags came up through the thin soles of Isabella's shoes as she walked the length of the nave to the altar. The Archbishop of Canterbury officiated. He anointed her hands with the chrism from a golden ampulla, and he spoke the old words over her head in the Latin of the pontifical, and she said the responses in the order she had been taught them. and then he set the crown upon her head. The diadem was heavy. It was the consort's crown of England, made of beaten metal with 5 tall points, set with flat garnet and pale sapphire in the older fashion, and it had been worn by the wives of English sovereigns for the better part of a century. Its weight on the head of a girl of scarcely a dozen years was the weight of a title and a function and a life that would be hers for as long as the husband who had given her the diadem kept his. She felt it on her temples and on the nape of her neck, and she held herself straight in the manner Alice had described when they had sat together on the evening before the wedding, and she did not let her hands move or her eyes wander from the altar where the cross stood in its candlelight. The cloth of gold of the mantle she wore was stiff at the shoulders and warm at the back. The paving was very cold. Behind her, in the nave, the leading houses of the realm had assembled, earls and bishops and their retinues, her father in his best riding cloak, close enough to the aisle to see the diadem set on his daughter's head. The lords from Poitou who had come across with John, the insular barons and their ladies in the rows behind, the chaplains of the various chapels in the rows nearest the altar, the candles on their iron stands, the smell of the wax and the old flags, and the cold morning air coming in from the transept doors. When the ceremony was done, the archbishop raised her up, and the congregation stood, and the organ spoke, and the choir of Westminster sang the Te Deum in the long old tune that had been sung in that church since the Norman rulers had rebuilt it. Isabella rose from her knees and turned to face the nave. And the nave was a sea of faces in the candlelight, and the crowd of faces moved and murmured. She walked the length of the aisle in the diadem, and the cloth of gold to the tall doors, and the morning brightness of October came in as the doors opened, and the sound of the city outside, the bells of the city churches beginning to ring, one after another, as the news ran out from the abbey, came in with the daylight. She was scarcely more than a child. She was the crowned wife of the throne across the sea. The feasting that followed lasted 3 days, in the wide space at Westminster and then at the Tower, and Isabella sat beside John and received the homage of the leading households, and ate the food set before her, and drank the wine very sparingly, and listened. At the end of the 3rd day, her women took her back to the private apartments, unlaced the cloth of gold, and took the diadem from her head, and set it in its box. And she sat in the chair by the fire, and let her women comb out her hair. South at home, a rider arrived at the Charente residence, and gave Isabella's father a letter sealed with the new consort's own matrix, the seal that had been cut for her in London by John's goldsmith, a standing woman in a diadem with a sceptre in her right hand. The Count read it in his private quarters upstairs, and the estate steward recorded in the retinue's roll that a note from his daughter had arrived, and that it was in good order. Alice read it after her husband, and then folded it and put it in the locked chest, where she kept the correspondence she did not want read by others. And she went to the sanctuary, and said the Psalm Beatus Vir in the clear middle voice that she had taught the child to say it, and lit a candle at the altar of the Virgin. Across the border, in the hall at Coué, Hugh Lebrun of Lusignan read a different letter. His was not from the bride, it was from Taillefer, written in the plain hand of a man who does not know exactly what the right form of address should be for a letter that explains that the daughter he had promised you has been given to an anointed monarch. The letter arrived a week after the coronation. Hugh read it once, and then he sat for a time by his own hearth with the parchment in his hand, and the fire burning low on the stones before him. Then he sent for his own chaplain. He was going to write to Philip, the Capetian sovereign. The letter Hugh Lebrun sent to the king's city was not, in the first instance, a declaration of war. It was a legal document, careful in its phrasing, drawn up with the help of the Lusignan chaplain and a canon lawyer who came over from Poitiers for the purpose. It set out the terms of the betrothal agreement between the Lusignan house and the house of Taillefer, the sum of the dower that had been agreed, the date of the agreement, the signatories, and the seal. It then set out what had happened to that agreement. It used the word violation, which was the word the canon law used for the taking away of a promised bride. It asked Philip, as overlord of the Duchy of Aquitaine, and as the tribunal of final appeal for the greater houses of Poitou, to hear the Lusignan case and to give judgment. Philip received the letter that autumn at his royal palace with the expression of a man who has been given, without having to go looking for it. Precisely the tool he had been looking for. He had been watching the Angevin Empire for 20 years with the patience of a man who knows that a great current will undercut even the heaviest bridge if it has enough time. He had been looking with that same patience for the point at which the Angevin structure had been built too high above its foundations. Here now, in the hand of a Lusignan chaplain, was the stone that had been pulled from the base. Under the law of the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vassal who had been wronged in his honour by his overlord had the right of appeal to the next tribunal up the chain. If the Angevin ruler as Duke of Aquitaine had wronged Hugh le Brun, Hugh could appeal to Philip as the Duke's own overlord. If Philip upheld the plea, he could summon John to answer the charge in a Capetian tribunal. If John did not appear, and John was not likely to appear, being an anointed prince before a foreign panel, Philip could declare him in default and confiscate his continental lands. The Norman lands, the honour of Maine, the lordship of Touraine, all of them held of the northern crown, all of them liable to confiscation if John was found in default. This was not a minor piece of litigation. This was, if Philip chose to press it to its conclusion, the legal lever that could be used to detach the whole of the Angevin Empire from its ruler across the sea. And all of it had been made possible, in the last analysis, by a prince who had ridden 3 days in the Charente country and decided to take a girl because she was beautiful and because her lands sat on a road. Philip accepted the Lusignan appeal. He summoned John to answer at a Capetian tribunal. His clerks sent out the writs that same autumn, each one sealed with the great matrix of the Capetian throne and carried by royal messengers in the crown's livery. At Couhay, Hugh le Brun received Philip's response and paid his chaplain a handsome sum for the drafting of the original document. At Winchester, John received the summons and said, in the abrupt manner he had, that he was not minded to ride north to be judged by a foreign panel on a matter that was entirely within his own province, and that Philip could address himself to his bishops if he had a complaint to make. He sent the messenger back with a formal refusal. The refusal was expected. The machinery of the confiscation began. At Winchester, in her smaller rooms, Isabella understood something of this in the way that a woman at the centre of a leading establishment recognizes the matters the household does not say aloud through the changed weight of conversations when she entered a room, through the speed with which John's riders came and went, through the number of bishops and barons who began to appear in November and December and sit in the rooms with her husband and come out with their faces careful. Her chamberlain, an old man who had served 3 consorts, came and told her nothing. Her women told her nothing. The elder linen woman brought her a posset of warmed wine and honey at bedtime and said only that the country was a little stirred by leading affairs, as it always was in autumn. Isabella sat in her Winchester rooms through that early winter and learned her new tongue from the matron and Latin from the new royal chaplain, and practiced the hand she wrote her letters in on a wax tablet. She added to her daily offices a new prayer for the safety of her husband, which the royal chaplain had written out for her in a good clear hand on a slip of parchment. She had the slip of parchment pinned to the edge of the page in her missal. She had the doors of the outer chamber opened in the mornings, when the day was clear, so that the pale wash of the winter sky came in and fell across the tiled floor. Outside, on the roads of Poitou and Anjou, the world was moving toward a reckoning. Hugh Le Brun's appeal was working its way through the machinery of the Capetian crown. The leading lords of Poitou, who had watched the Angevin Empire for a generation, were sitting in their seats and making the preparatory calculations of men who were trying to decide which side of a coming division they wished to be on when the division comes. The oil trade down the Charente ran on. The cathedral bell above the pale valley rang the hours in the cold, clear air. And in her apartments at Winchester, her missal lay open on the prayer desk at the slip of parchment with the prayer for John's safety, and the fire was warm, and the tiled floor held the pale wash of the northern winter. 2 springs later, the machinery came to its conclusion. Philip pronounced John in default of appearance, declared his continental lands forfeit, and invested his own son and heir with Normandy, and his ally Arthur of Brittany with Anjou and Poitou. It was not, at that moment, a real conquest. It was a legal declaration, a set of words on parchment in Paris. But it was a beginning. John needed to hold his continental lands by force now, because he no longer held them by law. The army came north across the sea that summer, and the war for Normandy and the Angevin holdings on the mainland began in earnest. Isabella was 14. She was not on the campaign. She was in her own chambers, moving between Winchester and Marlborough and the Tower of London in the usual migration of the royal establishment between its several houses. The news of the war came to her through the same channels it had come before. Through the shifted weight of the rooms and the speed of the riders and the careful faces of the lords after a forenoon with her husband. Sometimes in the evenings John came and ate with her in the consort's suite, and he was companionable in those hours, talking about the horses he had ridden and the charters he had signed and the bishops who had pleased or vexed him. He did not, in those evenings, talk about the war in France, not because he was holding it from her, but because it was his habit to hold his domestic life and his political life in separate buildings in his mind. And the household suite was a domestic building. She offered him, in the winter that followed, the company of her supper table. She sat with him and listened and spoke when spoken to, and did not ask about the war. She had her missal and her psalter on the prayer desk. She had the old linen woman to tend her linen, her candlesticks, and her medicine coffer. She had a young woman from a minor Poitou family, sent over as a companion by her husband, who played the harp tolerably and who was company in the long afternoons. She had, in a small box on the writing table, the notes from her homeland that her father sent twice a month, each one telling her in his plain hand about the weather, the state of the oil pressing, the condition of the cathedral, and the health of her mother, and ending with the formulaic close of an Angoumois clerk's dispatch, the greeting of a parent's people to a daughter across the sea. The last of those dispatches arrived in the winter of 1203. In the following spring, Aymer Tailefer died. He died as a man who had kept his lands well in his own bed, in the space where his daughter had been born, with Alice beside him and the family chaplain reading from the Gospel of St. John. He had held his honour for 20 years and had managed it carefully, and had married his one daughter to a crown across the sea, and had lived long enough to see her anointed. He was buried in the cathedral at the escarpment above the water. In the chapel of the Taillefers, under a slab, Alice had ordered from the stone cutters of the district. The honour passed, at his death, to Isabella. She was 16. She was across the sea. Her lands were run in her name by a bailiff whom the crown had named, and the clerks went on writing what were now her charters in the same careful hand, with the same deep blue wax on the weightier documents. Alice remained above the scriptorium where her husband had died and went on directing the staff, as she had directed them for a quarter of a century. The old chamberwoman at Winchester carried the news of the Count's death to her mistress gently, at a still hour, with the fire already built up. Normandy fell to Philip in the summer that same year. Chateau Gaillard, the imposing fortress Richard had built above the Seine, fell in March after a long siege. Rouen, the capital of the duchy, submitted to Paris in June. The Angevin Empire, which had run from the border of Scotland to the border of Spain for 60 years, was finished on the continent as an empire. What remained to John on the mainland was a strip of coastline, the Duchy of Aquitaine in the south, and the loyal port of Bordeaux. Everything that had been Norman or Angevin or Manso, the castles and the revenues and the halls and the older religious houses, was now in the hands of the Capetian throne. The news came to Winchester on a July forenoon, by a rider who had crossed from Normandy in a fishing vessel after Rouen had fallen. John was in residence when the rider came, and the rider went to his chambers, and not to Isabella's. And it was 2 hours before one of his lords came to her rooms to tell her, in the formal and careful manner these matters were told in leading establishments, that Normandy was lost. Isabella received the news in the way she had been trained by Alice of Courtenay to receive important news, still, in her chair, with her hands folded. She asked, in a steady voice, whether husband was well. She was told that he was well. She asked whether Aquitaine was held. She was told that Aquitaine was held. She said, then, that she wished to hear a mass said, and she went to her oratory and knelt before the altar where the missal lay open at the prayer for John's safety. And she stayed there for the better part of an hour. Outside her window, the July rain of the Midlands was coming in across the flood meadows, and the meadow grass was very green, and the brook ran brown with the summer thaw. The writing office at Winchester had ledgers. They were kept by the royal clerks in the rooms below the wide hall, and in them were recorded the names and revenues and renders of the leading houses across the sea and the Angevin lands on the mainland. After Normandy fell, the entries that had listed the Norman castles and the Norman abbeys and the Norman toll roads were struck through with a careful line in red ink. And the entry Duchy de Normandie was given a marginal note in the clerk's steady hand that said Perdu au roi Philippe en la 1204, which was to say, lost to Philip in that same summer. The ledger was then closed and placed on its shelf in the row with the other ledgers, and the clerks turned to the next folio. Isabella's chambers at Winchester carried the scent, in that autumn, of the rushes that had been freshened, and of the dried lavender the elder woman put in the linen, and of the faint wood smoke that crept back when the wind was north. She had been offered, that season, a new set of embroidery silks by her husband, a gift sent up from London by one of his merchants, a set of skeins in the colours of the warmer region, the blue of Bordeaux and the deep red of Poitou, and a yellow the colour of new-pressed oil. And she had set a piece of linen in the embroidery frame, and begun to work a pattern of vines. She worked at it in the afternoons when the day was bright, and in the evenings by candlelight. And by December, the vines ran all across one corner of the linen, neat and close, going nowhere in particular, and covering a good deal of ground. His travelling establishment was not a settled matter. It moved, in the manner of all medieval courts, but more restlessly than most, between Winchester and Marlborough and Corfe and Gloucester and the Tower of London and the lesser royal manors along the Thames. John was a man who did not like to sit. He rode his realm hard and often, and the household went with him. The coffers and the carts and the horses, the clerks of the writing chancery and the clerks of the kitchen, the clerks of the wardrobe and the clerks of the seal, the knights of the escort, and the women of the chamber and the hunting dogs. Isabella went with them, or she stayed in one of the fixed residences while he rode ahead and back. Her inner circle, the linen woman, the companion from Poitou with the harp, the royal chaplain, the locked coffer with the valuables, was packed and unpacked so often in the span of the early consortship that the coffers themselves showed the wear, the leather of the straps going soft and the iron corners going dull. The chambers Isabella occupied in these decades were similar to each other in their essential form. They had a fireplace at one end and a window at the other, and between them the furniture of a consort's life. The prayer desk and the writing table and the embroidery frame and the carved oak chairs and the bed with its curtains drawn back in the daytime. The hangings changed from residence to residence, but they were always there. A piece of embroidered cloth, or a painted panel, or a length of wool in the Angevin red. The scent of them shifted with the season-dried herbs in autumn, wood smoke in winter, beeswax in the spring when the candles were newly made. Each chamber had its iron brazier and its row of candlesticks in the chapel alcove and its locked box on the writing table. John came and went in these apartments. He was not a cold husband, in the manner of some prominent men who treat a wife as a political appointment and see her only at large ceremonies. He was, in the intervals between his courts and his campaigns, and his quarrels with the church and his quarrels with the barons, often at her side of an evening, and he was companionable in the way a man is companionable who is used to getting his own way, but who is also genuinely fond. He had given her, since the coronation, a necklace of pearls, 3 rings, a reliquary of the true cross, set in crystal and gilt, a book of romances, bound in red calfskin, and a bay horse. He had appointed her dower lands, the revenues of her southern honour, which were hers already, plus a share of the consort's fee. The traditional payment insular queens received from every goldsmith in the land who sold a piece above a certain weight. He was also, in those same years, a man who kept mistresses, as the chroniclers of the insular realm were careful to note, and who had natural children from before the marriage, who appeared at his household and had to be placed and provided for. Her apartments knew this in the way such apartments always know such things, through the chamber women, who knew the chamber women of the other apartments, and through the careful silences where the matron kept the linen and the medicine chest. Isabella was not a girl who showed what she knew in her face. Alice of Courtenay had taught her something harder and more useful than the offices of the chapel. The composed look a well-bred lady keeps in a chamber where the conversation has gone somewhere she has chosen not to follow. She kept that look. The old servant tended the linen. The embroidery frame carried the vines. John's court was also, in those years, under a suspicion that was its own. He had the Angevin quality of mistrusting everyone, including himself, and the quality was not improved by the loss of Normandy or by the steady worsening of his relations with the important barons of the realm, who had their own ideas about how much revenue the crown was entitled to take and how much of it should go to paying for the war overseas. The residences the retinue moved between were places in which the castle locks were checked at night, and the guests' horses were stabled in the inner ward where the grooms could count them. His own quarters, wherever the retinue went, had 2 parts, an outer and an enclosed one, and access to the guarded one was given to fewer men each year. The important lords who sat on the council had begun some years into John's reign to come to the council table with their own men behind them, not because this was the custom, but because not to do so was to feel, in those chambers, somewhat unprotected. Isabella's suite was set, in every residence, between John's own and the outer chamber, in the arrangement of a consort's lodging that both granted her access to his domestic life and insulated her from the public business of the court. She was not at the ministerial table. She was not in the audience halls where the barons came and went. She was in the household rooms, with the fire and the embroidery frame and the prayer desk, and through the walls of them she could hear. When the household was settled and the outer floor was full, the sound of men's voices discussing her husband's business at a volume that was not quite audible through the stone. Beside her, she had her chaplain and her linen keeper and her companion from Poitou, and she maintained the 3 kinds of hours she had learned in her earlier home: the daybreak devotions, the day's business of dispatches and accounts, the evening reading, she wrote. She wrote to her mother at home, to the bailiff who ran her lands in her name, to the prior of La Couronne, where the Taillefer chantry sat, to the bishop who tended the cathedral, and, once or twice, to a coastal port on matters of her family's church. She wrote in the Angoumois, hand her paternal scribe had taught her, with the slightly forward lean that his writing had always carried, and she closed each one with her seal pressed flat into the cooling wax. She preserved a box of red wax for routine work and a pot of the deep blue for her homeland dispatches in the tradition of the family chancery. At night, when the retinue had settled and the fire had been banked and the women had gone to their own beds, the locked coffer stood at the foot of the bed, wherever she was, and inside it, under her jewels and the reliquary of the true cross, the original psalter from her homeland lay wrapped in its linen sleeve with the plain cross of silver that Alice had put there in the year of the Lusignan coffer. It had not been taken out and used in the way that the bigger psalter had been used, but it was there. The linen sleeve still held the faint ghost of the dried herbs from the Bordeaux garden, if a nose were put close enough to it in a very still corner. The child was born at Winchester, in Isabella's chambers, in the first days of the October, 7 years after her coronation. He was a boy, and he was healthy, and he was named Henry, the name of the imposing grandfather across the sea, the Angevin ruler who had made the empire that John was currently doing his best to hold together. The birth had been long, and Isabella had been attended by the royal physician and by 2 midwives appointed by John and by the old linen keeper who had watched over the linen and the medicine coffer since the early days of the consortship. When it was over, the physician came out and told the father that his lady had delivered safely, and that the infant was a boy. And John gave the physician a ring of gold, and the news was carried to the chapel of Winchester Castle, where the chaplain sang a Te Deum with the chapel choir. She was 19 when her firstborn was born. She lay in her bed with the infant in the crook of her arm, and the fire built up to the warmth the midwives had specified, and the curtains drawn back so that the daylight fell on both of them. The old linen keeper waited at the foot of the bed. The 2 midwives were tidying. Outside, the elder woman could hear the establishment beginning to celebrate, the sound of voices raised and a distant bell beginning to ring. The infant was put to a wet nurse within the hour, as the infants of anointed wives were. The nurse had been chosen from the daughters of a Hampshire knight who had 3 healthy young ones of her own, and strong arms and a steady manner, and she was installed in a set of rooms adjoining Isabella's, where a new cradle of oak had been put in with a cover of embroidered wool and a carved panel at the head. Isabella saw the boy brought to her in the forenoons, and held him for the duration of a prayer. And then the nurse carried him back, and the routine business of her chambers went on around this new and central arrangement. The boy was christened in the chapel of Winchester Castle, with the Bishop of Winchester officiating and his father serving as godparent. And after the christening, John gave a feast in the wide hall and invited the nearest of the leading barons who were then in the castle's vicinity. Isabella was not at the feast. She was still in her rooms, in the week of recovery that the midwives specified. But the chamberlain came in to tell her that it had gone well, and that her husband had drunk the health of his son in a cup of Poitou wine, and that the barons had drunk it after him with a reasonable display of cheerfulness. In the weeks after the birth, the private suite acquired a new quality. It had always been a place of deliberate stillness of the fire, and the embroidery frame, and the prayer desk, and the elder servant's steady presence. But now, from the adjoining side, there came the unmistakable sounds of a new life being tended, the creak of the cradle, the nurse's low singing, and occasionally, at the hours that appetite required, the brief urgent voice of the infant himself, followed quickly by the nurse's soothing, and then hush again. Isabella heard these sounds in the usual running of her day, and noted them the way a careful listener notes a familiar piece of music. She paid the nurse well, and checked the infant herself each dawn. She had the old woman inspect the cradle wool, for any sign of damp or cold. She brought the midwives back to visit twice in the first month, and asked them, in the methodical manner of a person who had been taught by a methodical mother, each question about the boy's feeding and sleep and colour that the midwife's knowledge could answer. She noted on a wax tablet, in a brief daily hand, the boy's weight as estimated by the nurse, and the colour of his face, and whether he had accepted his feed. The wax tablet was not preserved. It was a working document, not an archive. But the note-keeping was the same impulse that had driven the chancery at Angoulême for 2 centuries. The belief that what happens should be written down and the record preserved. The boy grew. In the months after his birth, he went through the usual stages of a well-tended infant, the strengthening of the neck, the first deliberate looking around, the first real grip of a hand. By the following spring, he was beginning to make the noises that precede speech, and the nurse would bring him to the smaller chambers and hold him up so his mother could see the face working through its new expressions. He had the Angevin look to him, the dark hair of John's family, the slightly heavy jaw, the wide eyes that were not blue in the way of the infants of the north, but a dark colour that would not settle for some months. He looked, the old woman said, like a lord of high blood. John, when he came in the evenings, would hold the boy on his knee and talk to him in the easy way of a man who is pleased with something he has made. And the boy would gaze into that face with the serious attention of a very young creature trying to understand a very wide world. The staff at Winchester settled around the child as royal establishments settle around an heir, the cradle acquiring its own orbit of attendants, the nurse acquiring her quiet authority, the matron organising the washing of the cradle cloths in the laundry room below with the same methodical care she gave to her mistress's own linen. The boy was an heir of the realm and the son of a countess of the Charente and the great-great-great-grandson of a Capetian monarch, and none of these facts were present to him in any form he could use. He was present to a warm nursery and a nurse and a mother who came in the mornings with steady hands and a face that, when it looked down at him, had in it something that the face kept out of all the other parts of her apartments. It was in this same year that John's quarrel with the papacy reached the point at which Innocent III, the Pope, decided to impose on the kingdom across the sea a punishment that had not been used on a whole realm in the memory of any living man. The quarrel was about the Archbishopric of Canterbury, about who had the right to appoint the Archbishop, the Pope or the King, and it had been going on for 2 years in the formal manner of a dispute between 2 institutions that both wrote very good Latin. The following spring the Pope pronounced the interdict. An interdict was not an excommunication. Though it felt like one to the people under it, it did not cut the kingdom off from God or from the possibility of salvation. It cut it off from the public performance of the sacraments. The churches fell silent. The bells ceased. No mass was sung in the nave of any cathedral north of the Channel. The baptisms of the country's infants were performed in the reduced and private form that the interdict permitted. The marriages of the country's couples were made without the blessing of a priest in the open church. The dead were buried in the churchyards without the church's office. Quietly, in the early morning, with only the family present. The effect on a country accustomed to hearing the bells was the effect of a long sound suddenly stopping. The countryside in those years described a peculiar hush to visitors from the continent. A hush that was not the calm of a rest day, but the pause of a machinery that had gone still. The abbeys that lined the roads were still inhabited, still going about the private business of their cloistered offices, but their doors were shut to the public world. The market crosses of the northern towns, where masses had been said for the town's dead on the feast days, stood silent. The great cathedrals with their stone naves and their long windows, echoing with the sound of absence, were to the people who had built them and loved them a kind of pain. In Isabella's private oratory at Winchester, the royal chaplain continued to perform the daily offices. This was permitted. The interdict did not extend to the domestic chapels of the ruling family, which had special dispensation from the Pope for the routine ceremonies of life and death. So her forenoon hours were still said, and the wax lights were still changed, and the oratory still had its lamp burning before the altar. But through the narrow window of the sanctuary, and down in the valley of the Itchen below the castle walls, the church of St. Cross, which had been saying masses for the poor since the era of the first crowned Henry, remained shut. Its doors fixed with an iron bar at the Pope's order, its bells silenced. Isabella understood what she had been told by the royal chaplain about the reasons for the interdict, and she saw for herself what her window revealed: the shut church doors, the absence of the bell. She was also aware what the linen woman told her about the country people, who were afraid, in the wordless way of people whose calendar is made of feast days, that something had come undone in the fabric of the world. She maintained the private chapel. She paid the chaplain an extra stipend from her own dower for the additional offices he was saying in the private chapel on behalf of the establishment's dead. The cook who had died of a fever in March, the groom who had been killed by a horse in April. She had her firstborn baptized in the full form as the interdict allowed for the young of the royal house, and she had the ceremony performed with the same care she had seen Alice of Courtenay bring to the ceremonies of the chapel at Angoulême. The interdict ran, in the end, for 6 years, 6 winters of shut doors and silent bells, and the dead buried quietly in the dawn glow without the church's voice over them. 6 calendars in which the king's quarrel with Innocent III grew and deepened and ramified into new quarrels about new matters. The interdict sat on the kingdom like a weighted cover over a fire, the warmth still there, the glow still there, but everything reduced to a lower register, a quieter scale. Her private oratory at Winchester had a round window above the altar, no larger than a cartwheel, set with a piece of glass that was not quite coloured, but had in it a faint amber tint from the sand and ash the glass-blower had used. In the forenoons, when the sun was at the right angle, which in Winchester meant a short interval of mid-forenoon in the autumn and winter, the amber daylight came through the round pane and fell in a bright patch on the paving of the sanctuary, a foot or two in front of the altar. The chaplain had placed, in the early days of the interdict, a hassock at that exact spot, so that whoever knelt there at that hour would feel the warmth of the sun on their hands as they held them up in the attitude of prayer. Isabella used the hassock every dawn, in the quarter hour between the end of the Lord's recitation and the beginning of the day's business. The sun came and went depending on the cloud, but when it was there, it was the warmth of a warmer country. And when it was not there, the paving was the paving of the north. In those same 6 years of the interdict, the younger set were born. Richard came at Oxford, where the household was passing the winter, a second healthy son, darker than her firstborn, and with his sire's quick eyes, who was named for the dead uncle, whose memory the crown honoured and bestowed as a gift, by his christening, a pair of silver spurs from the royal treasury. Joan followed at Gloucester the next season, a girl of dark hair and a strong constitution who would grow up to be wed north to the Scottish crown. Isabella came in the year before Runnymede, at Gloucester again, and Eleanor a season later, in her mother's Aquitanian honour for the Queen, had crossed to her own inheritance that winter for the last visit, to see Alice. and Eleanor had come early on that journey. The births were attended by the same midwives and the same physician and the same elder woman in various royal chambers that all had the same essential form. The fire at one end, the window at the other, the curtains of the bed drawn back, the physician waiting outside. Each infant was given its nurse and its cradle and its ring of attendants in the same systematic way that her firstborn had been offered his. And each one was checked in the forenoons by their mother's own hands and noted on the wax tablet. The wax tablets were not preserved. The notes went back into the wax after they were no longer needed, as all working documents do, 4 children in 5 years in 4 different royal residences, by a consort who was also managing the correspondence of her southern honour from her writing table in the inner suite and trying to keep the 3 kinds of hours, the morning offices, the day's business, the evening reading. That had been the architecture of her life since she was a child on a low stool at her mother's knee. In the years of the younger children's births, the establishment had grown larger and more complicated, because each child brought its own set of servants, and each set of servants brought its own set of relationships and obligations. The nurse of the eldest held rank over the nurse of the second, and the nurse of the second above the nurse of the third, and so down through a clear hierarchy of women that was governed by conventions. The old woman understood better than anyone and administered with steady authority. The row of small shoes by the nursery door of Winchester, 1 pair for each of them, was the sight the linen keeper presented to her mistress at first dawn before Isabella went to the oratory. The shoes were her daily audit. All 4 pairs present, all in their correct order, each one bearing the same slight scuff at the right toe that young feet make when they drag on paved floors. Isabella would look at the row, and the old woman would say, briefly, whether each of the 4 had slept and fed in the night, and Isabella would nod and go to the oratory, and the day's 3 kinds of hours would begin. The 4 children were different from each other, in the ways that 4 children born to the same parents always are, as if each one had taken a different portion of the inheritance. The eldest was the heir, and he had from his earliest years the quality of a child who knows he is watched, a deliberate, slightly formal manner in the nursery that made the nurses call him the little king before he was king at all. He was attentive to instruction and careful in his behaviour, with a streak of stubbornness in him that the matron recognised as the Angevin blood expressing itself in the only direction available to a well-managed child. He liked beautiful things. He would pick up a candlestick and examine it, or hold a piece of embroidery up to the window to see the colours, with the concentration of a child who is not yet old enough to name what he is looking at, but who is already attending to it. Richard was different in every respect, quicker, louder, less interested in being watched than in watching, and possessed of a restless physical energy that expressed itself in constant movement around whatever room he was in. Touching the corners of the furniture, and the hinges of the shutters, and the links of a chain that had been hung up to dry, and the ears of the dogs, and any other surface that his hands could reach. The nurses had to follow him the way nurses follow a child who has not yet learned that walls are for stopping at. He was fond of his brother in the offhand way of a second child who is secure in his second place and does not need to compete for it, and he was fond of his mother in the same offhand way, coming and going from her lap with the ease of a young creature that knows exactly where the warm place is. Joan was born with a temperament the old woman described as level. She slept when she was put down and woke at need and cried when she wanted attention and stopped when it was provided. And she sat in the nursery without requiring constant entertainment and watched her brothers with the interested tolerance of a person who finds other people's energy mildly interesting rather than exhausting. She would be handed in marriage 5 years after her father's death to Alexander II, King of Scotland, and she would carry to Edinburgh the same level temperament and the Scottish court would find her a restful presence at a juncture when the Scottish court needed one. She was 7 when the Civil War came to its climax, and she sat in the nursery at Corfe with the same equilibrium she had always shown, neither frightened nor reckless. The younger pair, Isabella and Eleanor, were too small in the span of the Civil War to have much character yet visible. They were the nursery's dependents, carried and fed and wrapped, not yet walking, not yet talking in sentences. They were placed into good nurses' hands. Eleanor, the younger, had been born in a hurry in the Angoumois country and had come into the world ahead of schedule in a set of rooms borrowed from the Count Seneschal in Angoulême, and she had been christened there by the Bishop of Angoulême before the party could return to the realm. Her godmother was the Seneschal's wife, which lent the youngest daughter of the king a godmother of a slightly humble sort. But the christening was done correctly and in good order, and Eleanor was small enough that the journey back across the sea did not trouble her, and she grew up healthy and in due course became the Countess of Pembroke. The nursery at Winchester and Corfe and Marlborough was a room that changed constantly in the decades of John's reign as the young ones grew, a room that went from the cradle scent and the nurse's lullaby of the first months to the clatter and running of the middle stretch, when the 2 eldest boys were old enough to knock their shoes against the wainscot, and Joan was old enough to sit on the floor and sort the painted wooden figures that the king had sent down from London one Christmas. The painted figures were soldiers and horses and one painted lion, which Richard had immediately claimed and which the older brother had been persuaded, with some effort, to accept had always been Richard's. The lion lived on a ledge in the nursery above the height a child's hand could reach, and it watched over the daily life of the nursery with the expression of painted animals, which have no expression at all, but which acquire, by long association, the face of the room they inhabit. Outside the nursery and the oratory, the realm was coming apart at its seams. The interdict ran on. The barons, who had been building their grievances against John's methods of taxation and his methods of justice and his methods of seizing hostages for good behaviour for the better part of a decade, were moving past the stage of private grievance into the stage of organised complaint. Sealed dispatches were going from one baronial hall to another, in the discreet form used by men who understood that the Crown's servants might be reading the highways of the shires. Meetings were being held in the northern counties, at Stamford and at Bury St. Edmunds, where the barons had a shrine that was beyond even John's reach. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who had come into his see only after the interdict had dragged on long enough to make John yield the point, was acting as an intermediary between the barons and the crown, and using in that intermediation a Latin document of Henry I's era called the Charter of Liberties, which set limits on what a sovereign could demand of his barons. From her own suite, the shape of this dispute was audible through the walls, through the different timbre the outer floor had when the barons came in numbers, through the increased speed of the riders arriving and departing, through the new locks the Constable of Winchester put on the castle's inner ward gate that winter. She recognised the names of the leading barons and the broad outlines of their complaints, because she was not a woman who lived in ignorance of the spaces beyond her own, and because the old linen woman, who had been at court since Eleanor's day, could read the signs of a baronial storm, as well as she could read the signs of weather coming in off the chalk downs. But she could not act on what she perceived, and she did not try. Her tools were the writing table and the seal and the prayer desk, not the chamber bench. In the June that followed, in a meadow beside the Thames, at a place called Runnymede, John set his seal to the charter that the barons had drawn up with the Archbishop's help, and the baronial revolt paused. The document was of 63 clauses, and it dealt in the careful language of men who have been thinking about grievances for a long period with the relationship between Crown and barons, the question of arbitrary imprisonment, the question of the levying of taxes without consent, The question of what limits could be placed on the ruler's power to seize what he needed without going through the forms the law required. It was a piece of considerable legal precision and considerable political ambition, and it was sealed in a meadow between the two parties, with the royal face maintaining the composed expression of a man who is signing something he intends to find a way out of as soon as possible. The news of the sealing at Runnymede came to her apartments by the afternoon of the day it happened, because Isabella was at Windsor at that point, which was 3 miles from the meadow at Runnymede, and the sound of the horns being blown when the seal was pressed had carried through the summer air far enough that the chamber women had gone to the upper windows and listened. The matron reported to her that the charter had been sealed, that her husband had ridden back to Windsor in good order, and that the barons had ridden back to their own camps in good order, and the meadow was clear by sunset. Isabella received this news as she had received the news of Normandy and the news of the interdict steadily in her chair, with her hands in her lap. She wrote that evening to her bishop at home about the progress of the transept repairs. She wrote to her steward about the oil revenues. She wrote, in a shorter dispatch, to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, asking him to have a mass said for the peace of the realm. The letters went out the next morning by her personal messenger, and the household at Windsor went about its business in the quieter atmosphere of a court that has been in a state of siege for 6 months, and has reached, at last. A pause. The pause did not last. By autumn, John had appealed to Rome to annul the charter, and Innocent obliged him at once, and the barons then reached over the sea to the Capetian heir, offering him the crown in exchange for his sword. He landed at Sandwich in Kent the following Easter with a fleet drawn from the ports of Boulogne and Calais, and the realm divided along the axis of baronial disaffection, and the civil war began in earnest. Isabella was at Corfe Castle in Dorset when the Capetian prince landed, and she remained at Corfe through the first months of the fighting in the private apartments of the fortress, which was one of the strongest of the royal holds beyond the water, and which sat on its high chalk escarpment above the heath like a bird with its claws in a post. The children were with her, the eldest 9 years old, Richard 7, Joan 6, and the 2 youngest, baby Isabella and Eleanor, barely walking. The nursery had been moved to the strongest central tower. The matron had the medicine chest, and the children's clothes, and the cradle of the youngest sorted and stacked in a corner of the interior space where they could be taken up in a moment. The constable of Corfe checked the well and the grain stores and the arrows and the rope for the drawbridge, and reported to his lady in the manner of a captain who has decided that she was the authority in this fort, not the distant and embattled ruler. John was on the road. He was always on the road in those last months, riding from castle to castle in the Midlands, trying to hold the realm together with a mixture of force and negotiation that was less effective each week. The riders from his camp came to Corfe on a regular schedule and brought his wife messages in his own hand. Short, hurried dispatches, the handwriting less controlled than the writing of the earlier years. The sentences clipped and quick. She kept these in the locked box on the writing table at Corfe and answered each one on the day it arrived in her steady Angoumois hand, with the news of the children and the state of the fortress and whatever she had been able to gather from the riders who came through about the state of the highways. The last of those dispatches arrived at Corfe that October. It was not from John himself. It was from one of his household knights, a man called de Burgh, who had been with him on the road north, and it told Isabella, in the careful formal language of such a message, that her husband had fallen ill at Lynn, in Norfolk, after crossing the Wash estuary, and that he had been carried to the castle at Newark, and that he had died there on the 19th of October in the night, of a fever that had run through him very fast. Isabella received the letter at Corfe on a cool October forenoon. She was sitting at the writing table in the smaller chamber when the messenger was led in by the linen woman. She read it once. She sat for a moment with the page in her hands, and the fire in the hearth burnt in its usual way, and the sound of the young ones in the nursery came through the partition wall. Richard's voice, and Joan's answering it, and the nurse saying some brief calming word. Then she folded it and put it in the locked box and asked the elder servant to send for the chaplain. He came and found her already in the oratory, on the hassock before the altar, in the attitude of prayer. He said the devotion for the dead with her, and the candle on the altar held its flame upright in the still air. The mantle of widowhood was a white one, by the custom of the realm's consorts. The linen woman brought it from the locked coffer. It had been there since the wedding, the white cloth cut at the same moment as the deep red one, made for this day in the way that a careful establishment makes items for days it hopes will not come soon, but recognizes will come in due course. Isabella put it on in the household chamber at Corfe, with the elders' hands at the clasp, and the young ones were carried in from the nursery and told by their mother in the plain and simple terms she used, that their father was dead and that their eldest brother was now the sovereign of the realm. The boy king was 9 years old. He stood in the close chamber at Corfe in his riding clothes, with his dark hair slightly untidy from the nursery, and he looked at his mother when she said these words, and then he straightened his back, in the unconscious way that a child straightens its back when it is given a large piece of information that it does not fully understand, but knows is of considerable weight. Isabella put her hand on his shoulder for a moment, and then she went back to the writing table and began to write. She penned first a note to the Bishop of Winchester, who was the most powerful of the churchmen then resident in the realm. She addressed William Marshall, the old Earl of Pembroke, who had been John's most loyal baron and who was the natural regent for a boy soon to be crowned. She reached out to the justiciar, who held royal justice in the sovereign's absence. She sent word to her steward far to the south on a different matter, a revenue dispute at home that had been waiting for 2 months for her attention and which was not going to wait any longer, even in a week of widowhood. She composed all of this in the afternoon of the day she had received the news of the king's death in her steady Angoumois hand, with the deep blue wax on the dispatches for her lands and the red wax on the correspondence for the insular lords, and her matrix, the standing woman with the sceptre, pressed careful and even into each one. Before continuing with the story, please subscribe to the channel if you have not yet done so. It is the simple act that keeps these stories coming. The crowning of Henry III took place not at Westminster, as the coronations of that realm had always been made, but at Gloucester, in the Abbey Church of St. Peter, in the last days of that same October. 11 days after John's death at Newark, Westminster was in the hands of the Capetian prince, who had come to take the throne across the sea, and so the coronation was made where it could be made, in the loyal city that still held out. The diadem that was placed on the boy's head was not the imposing crown of the realm that had been lost, along with a considerable portion of the royal treasure, in the famous crossing of the Wash estuary that had preceded his father's final illness. It was a plain gold circlet, a woman's fillet borrowed from his mother's own jewel box, beaten a little wider at the front by the goldsmith of Gloucester to look more like a diadem and less like an ornament. The Abbey of Gloucester was not Westminster. It was smaller, and the daylight in its nave was a more ordinary insular glow, coming through narrow windows in the thick Norman walls rather than through the high Gothic openings that Westminster had begun to acquire in Eleanor's time. The November morning was overcast, and the daylight in the nave was the flat wash of a grey autumn sky. Filtered through the stone, and the smell of the nave was old incense and the cold of a church that had been open all night in a chill October. The boy stood at the altar in the clothes his attendants had assembled in 3 days, a tunic of good wool in the Angevin red, a mantle of a heavier wool lined with a narrow band of miniver. And he stood as straight as he had stood in the inner room at Corfe, when his mother had told him he had inherited the throne, and the Bishop of Winchester put the circlet on his head. Isabella waited in a side aisle. She was in her white widow's mantle. She had the linen woman beside her, and 2 of the chamber women, and the 4 siblings, Richard, Joan, Baby, Isabella, and Eleanor, were with the nurses in the rearmost part of the nave, where they could be carried out quietly if they became a disturbance. From the side aisle, she could see the boy king's face in profile, the dark hair under the circlet, the shoulders squared in the narrow mantle, the feet in their new boots that were a size larger than his feet needed, so they would last through the coming months. William Marshall waited beside the altar, not in the clergy's position, but in the lay position, at the boy's right hand, the way a guardian remains beside his charge. He was in his 70th passing, and he had been at more coronations than he could count. He had been at the 2nd Angevins and Richards and John's, and he had the look of a man who is both completely at home in a church and completely aware of the political situation outside it. He wore his earl's coronet over his cap. His hands were still as big and steady as they had always been. He was going to run the realm for this boy, and he understood it, and he was doing it already in the way he held his place by the altar. His mother watched from the aisle and understood, with the clarity of a woman who had been reading the chambers of powerful men since she was a girl on a stool at Alice of Courtenay's knee, what the postures in that nave were saying. The boy at the altar was the sovereign. The old man at his right hand was the regent, in all but name. And the woman in the white mantle in the side aisle was the parent, who was not the regent, and who would not be the regent, and who was being offered the courtesy of the side aisle with all the unspoken thoroughness of a large political arrangement that had been made without her. She had not been asked. This was the shape of it. In the 11 days between John's death and the coronation, the letters had gone between the bishops and the leading barons and the old marshal, and the arrangement had been settled without Isabella being part of the settling of it. It was not, in the formal legal sense, an exclusion. She was the sovereign's parent, and her dower and her status were fully acknowledged. And no one had told her that she was not welcome at the coronation or at the ministerial gatherings. But the actual work of state was being run by the marshal and the justiciar and the Bishop of Winchester, and her seat at the table was the polite seat at the edge of a table where the main business was being done by other people. She was 28. She was countess in her own right, and the widow of an anointed prince, and the parent of a boy now upon the throne. And she was being managed by a council of insular men who trusted her about as far as they trusted any continental woman with an Aquitanian honour and a set of Aquitanian loyalties. She sat in the chamber when she was invited and did not sit in it when she was not invited. And she noted, over the winter that followed the coronation, that she was invited less and less often, and that the matters she was told were the matters the advisers had already decided, rather than the matters they were trying to decide. The advisers, for their part, were not unreasonable. The realm was at war. The Capetian Prince Louis held London. The barons who had invited him were still fighting. The finances of the realm were in the state of disarray that a decade of John's methods of revenue raising and then stretch of actual civil war had created. There was no space in the ministerial chamber for a widowed foreign consort whose interests ran across the water to an honour in Aquitaine. The marshal was doing the work. The justiciar was doing the work. The Bishop of Winchester was writing the letters. Isabella could retain her chambers and her sons and daughters and her dower rights, and she would be consulted when the board had the opportunity. The following spring, the war turned. William Marshall led the Loyalists at a battle in the streets of Lincoln, and the invaders and their baronial allies were routed. The Peace of Lambeth in September brought the war to its formal close, and the Capetian prince took his army back across the sea. The realm was the boy sovereign's, properly at last, with the old Marshal as regent and the charter as its new constitution, and the question of his mother not pressing anyone particularly. By that autumn, Isabella had made up her mind to go home. She told the old Marshal in a letter, formal and brief, that she intended to return to her own inheritance in the Charente, which required her presence and her rule, and that she would leave the boys and girls behind, in the usual care of the crown. The eldest was already crowned. The others were, in various stages, spoken for as princes and future brides of the north. The two smallest were still young enough for the nursery. They remained with their nurses under the Marshal's hand. Isabella packed the locked coffer one last occasion and rode homeward. She carried with her the linen woman, who was by now too old for the northern winters and had been wanting for 2 seasons to go homeward to die. She brought her 2 remaining women of Poitou. She folded into the packing the box of deep blue sealing wax and her own seal and the case of letters she had held over the decades, the notes from her father and the notes from her mother, and the dispatches from John in the last months of the war. She left behind the embroidery frame and the missal from the northern chapels and the new psalter that had been made for her in London. She left behind the memory of many seasons of consorts' chambers in various castles of the realm, each one with its fire at one end and its prayer desk at the other, and its view of a grey insular sky. She crossed the Channel in October in a vessel smaller than the royal ship she had crossed in as a new bride, and the white cliffs went behind her in the grey autumn sea. She came over the last low rise above the valley of the Charente in the November after Lambeth, and her homeland was below her on its limestone escarpment, with the cathedral bell sounding the hour in the afternoon and the smoke of the winter fires going up from the streets in thin columns against the pale sky. The old walls looked exactly as she had remembered them. The river was low, as it always was in November, running shallow over its pale bed between bare stripped banks. The scent of the pressed oil was in the air, from the autumn barns below the settlement. The same scent it had been when she was a girl of 7, carrying thin candles to a painted image in her mother's oratory. At the gate the seneschal was waiting, and behind him her honours officers in their winter cloaks. And behind them a group of the older servants of her father's hall, who had been in the service of the Taillefer's since before the current lady was born. One of them, an old man who had been the head groom in the Count's time, and who was now too old for the horses, and spent his days beside the wide kitchen fires, came forward when he saw the Countess ride in and knelt at her stirrup with his cap in his hands, in the old manner of the household, and held it there until she reached down and put her hand on his grey head and said, in the Angoumois accent that 16 years across the sea had not quite taken from her, that her people were glad to have her back. The old man said nothing. He stood up and stepped back and let her through. The upstairs place above the writing scriptorium had been maintained by Alice until her death 3 seasons before, and after that by the steward's wife, who honoured her old mistress's arrangements without altering a single hasp. What Isabella found upon entering felt less an inventory to be catalogued than the accumulated weight of a life. The smoothed board of the sill, where Alice had leant to watch the water in the autumns of Isabella's girlhood. The small darkening on the plaster beside the doorway, where a taper had been set night after night, the faint indentation in the floorboards, where Alice's writing table had rested for a quarter of a century. Even the loop of iron by the lintel, where a lantern was hung in the season of the pressing, held the polish that only a lifetime of touch will bring to iron. She sat in the chair by the fireplace, and ate the supper the steward's wife had prepared, a broth of the winter vegetables, bread from the town baker's, a cup of the Poitou wine from her father's own press. The fire was built up. The candles on the altar were lit, through the window that looked down on the river. The last brightness of the November day was going out of the sky above the valley, and the stream below was already dark. She was 29. She had been consort in a foreign realm, and now she was again what she had always been at heart, mistress of her own inheritance. The offices below were running in her name. In the morning, the administrators would bring her the work that had accumulated in the years of her absence, and there would be much of it. And she would begin to answer it in her steady script with the deep blue wax and her old seal pressed into it, and the town would know she was home. She was not thinking about the Lusignans that evening. Or if she was not thinking about them in the way the story will next have to describe. She was thinking about the fire and the broth and the scent of the pressing in the air and the cathedral bell that had already rung Compline and would ring matins before dawn, and about the upstairs place that had held her earliest life and her mother's life, and which was, in the particular warm plainness of a settled space that has been lived in and kept and loved, the shelter she had been carrying in the back of her mind for 16 years of grey, overseas skies and long insular winters. 3 years after her return south, in the spring, Isabella married again. The man she married was Hugh X of Lusignan, who was called Hugh le Brun after his father, as sons of that house named Hugh always were, and who was the son of the man she had been betrothed to at the age of 10. Before John had interrupted the arrangement, the circle that had been broken by John's intervention 2 decades earlier was closed at last by this union. The Charentay honour and the Lusignan castles were joined at last. The circumstances of the union were, on the surface, a little irregular. She had come home as a widow of the English throne, and her son now ruled that realm, and the crown at Paris had a treaty interest in the disposition of her hand, because whoever wed her would have, through her, a claim to stand in the Angevin sphere in the southwest of France. Her son's council had been making arrangements for her to be matched to someone useful to the sovereign. The negotiations had been proceeding for some time, in the deliberate fashion of councils that have many things to decide at once. She did not wait for the council to complete its work. She wrote to the young king that spring, and told him she had taken Hugh as her husband. The council of the young ruler received this news with the mixture of irritation and practical resignation that the councils of young monarchs tend to apply to things that cannot be undone. Hugh X was not an enemy of the crown across the sea. He held his lands of the Angevin crown in the Duchy of Aquitaine, which made him a vassal of her son rather than a rival. The Lusignan house had been, since the humiliation of Hugh IX's appeal north, sufficiently chastened in its Capetian ambitions to be a useful rather than a dangerous neighbour. The marriage, whatever its origins, was not a catastrophe. The council wrote back to her and told her, in formal and not entirely warm terms, that the marriage was noted. Isabella wrote back and told them, in terms equally formal, that she was grateful for their understanding. The wedding itself was made in the spring, in the Lusignan manner. Hugh X was a broad man of his father's type, the same hair, the same jawline, the solid practical soldierly bearing that the family had always carried. He was in his early 30s that season, which put him at roughly the same relation to Isabella's 31 or 32 as his father had been when the first betrothal was arranged, and this coincidence was not lost on either of them, though neither was the kind of person who said so aloud. He had not been married before. He had been engaged in the way of leading lords in his country in the management of his inheritance since his father's death, and the work had taken all his attention and left no room for a wife until now. The ceremony was made in the seat at Cohay, in late April, with the spring just fully arrived in the country between the Charente and Poitiers. The hawthorn in blossom along the field borders, the willows yellow-green in the low places, the air still cool in the mornings, but warm by midday in the sheltered valleys. The chamber was hung with the family colours, the red and silver of a house that had been prominent for 3 generations and knew how to make a feast. The tables were covered with red silk, laid over the rough oak, and the cups were silver, and the wine in the cups was the best of the local pressing. A red wine of more body and less refinement than the Bordeaux vintages, Isabella had drunk at her first wedding. She was older at this wedding than she had been at the first. She had been 12 at the Garonne Cathedral, a child in an ivory gown on her father's arm. She was 31 or 32 at Cohe, a bride in her own riding cloth. With 16 years of insular consortship and 3 years of county governance in her hands and in her bearing. She gave her hand and said her words. And this time the ceremony had no archbishop, and no wide banners, and no city of bells beginning to ring. It had the spring sun coming through the narrow windows, and the smell of the April earth coming in through the open door at the far end. And the voices of Hugh's affinity raised in a toast that went around the table twice before the steward had to ask for quiet. Upstairs, the chancery wrote a new dispatch. It went to the bishop and to the Archbishop of Bordeaux and to the young king's council over the sea and to the stewards of the several manors that made up her revenue base. And it informed all of them that Isabella had made a second marriage with Hugh X, Count of La Marche and Lord of his Lusignan castles, and that the union of the 2 houses was now made in the proper legal form. The letter was sealed with her own matrix, still the standing woman with the sceptre that had been cut for her as consort, and with a new device that the local goldsmith had made for Hugh X to mark the occasion. A mounted knight on one face, and the family arms on the other. The offspring of the second marriage came quickly. The first was another Hugh, born a season or 2 after the wedding, who would be called Hugh XI when the moment came, and who had his father's hair. Then came another son, named for her father, who would be sent in due course across the sea and would rise there to the bishopric-elect of Winchester. Then William, called William de Valence, who would become one of the most powerful men in the court of the ruler across the sea. The third crowned Henry. Then Guy and Geoffrey, who would remain on the continent and hold their sire's lands. Then 4 daughters, Alice, another Isabella, Marguerite, and one whose name the records have not preserved. 8 sons and daughters, 9 perhaps, born across that decade, in the halls of Poitou and the chambers of the Charente estate, each one arriving in the usual way into an establishment already managing the previous one's needs. The nursery in those decades was a lively place. The floor of the wide chamber in her ancestral seat, which in her own girlhood had been a settled space of 2 kinds. The official kind for her sire's business, and the domestic kind for his evenings, was now a floor with the young on it at most hours of the day. The Aquitanian babies were not the quiet, well-managed infants of a northern royal nursery with a linen woman and a physician and a wax tablet audit of daily weights. They were the small ones of a rural hall, noisy, numerous, and looked after by a shifting company of nurses and older heirs of the establishment, who minded the younger ones in the off-hand manner of busy houses where the little ones were expected to sort themselves out. Isabella ran the nursery with the same systematic care she had run the Winchester nurseries, but she ran it in the Aquitanian style rather than the northern one, with less ceremony and more warmth, with the young ones fed at the domestic table rather than apart, with the older sons assigned their own tasks that tied them into the establishment rather than setting them apart from it. Hugh, the eldest, sat at his sire's right hand at supper when he was old enough to sit at a table, and he was offered the customary tasks of a lord's heir, the riding out to the outlying farms, the sitting in the judgment seat at the family assize, the Latin of the writing scribes. The second boy was sent to be educated, at his mother's direction, in a way that pointed him toward the church. He had, from early boyhood, the disposition for books that the Courtenay blood occasionally threw up, and Isabella recognized it as she had recognized the same trait in herself at the Psalter desk in her earliest seasons. William was the one who looked most like the northern side of the family. He had not his father's heaviness, but a slighter build, and the dark Angevin eyes. And Isabella saw in him, sometimes, the look of his half-brother across the sea, when that older prince had been young, the look of a boy who has been told that the world is large, and who is deciding, quietly, how much of it he intends to have. She gave William the silver cross that had come south from her earliest home in the original bridal coffer, the one Alice of Courtenay had put in the chest as a spare before the ride north 30 years before. He wore it under his shirt on the left side, against the skin, in the way his mother had always worn the twin of it. Her ancestral old hall in those decades was full of noise and fire, and the aroma of cooking, and the sound of the young ones, and the counting of revenues. And behind all of it, in the upper room above the writing chancery, Isabella sat in the forenoons with the day's correspondence, and worked through it in the methodical manner she had always worked. The dispatches from across the channel came regularly from her son's advisers about revenues and the question of various military obligations, from the young king himself when he wrote, in the rounded hand of an educated ruler who had learned to write later than she had, and whose Latin was more confident than his mother tongue, from the sons and daughters in the north, Joan in Scotland, now as the Scottish consort, Richard growing into the imposing man he would become as the Earl of Cornwall. The letters were answered the same day they arrived, unless the reply required a delay for thought, and they were stored in the locked coffer that had followed her from Winchester to Corfe to her homeland, and which was now so battered with travel that the keeper of her linen, the aged servant, had died at her post, as she had wanted, in a warm chamber with the fires up, and had been replaced by a younger woman of similar competence, had ordered it relined with fresh red wool that autumn. Her honour itself was well administered. The steward was a man of the local families, chosen by Isabella from among 3 candidates, and kept in place because he did his work without requiring supervision. The toll roads along the Charente ran their traffic, the wine and the pressed oil going north and west to the coast, the northern wool and the Flemish cloth coming back. The cathedral was in the middle of a repair to its south transept, paid for partly from her own dower and partly from the fees the archbishop had levied on the cathedral's market rights. The chantry of the Taillefer's at the Abbey of La Couronne was endowed with a new mass for the soul of Isabella's father, paid for by his daughter in the year of her return, and the abbey had acknowledged the gift with a letter in a very fine hand that praised her in the standard formulary terms and thanked the house of Taillefer for its long patronage. Between her lands and the wider world, the position of Isabella and her second husband was the position that had always been the natural one of the lords of the Atlantic marches between 2 crowns, neither fully the servant of one nor the other. The Capetian crown was the legal overlord of Poitou, the region in which Hugh's castles sat. The Angevin crown, through the province of Aquitaine, which was a separate lordship running south from Poitiers to the Pyrenees, was the overlord of her own honour. She owed her southern estate to the throne across the sea. He owed his lands to the Capetian court. Between the two of them, the establishment straddled the border between 2 large spheres of power that were not at peace with each other and never quite managed to be at war. Through the following decade, the balance of power between the 2 crowns in the Aquitanian country was shifting decisively toward the Seine. The war of the 8th Capetian sovereign's short reign, the campaign that the French prince made against the crown's position in Poitou, seized the honour of La Marche and much of the Poitou heartland from Hugh X and put it in royal hands. He made his submission that season formally with the ceremony of a vassal doing homage to an overlord, and accepted his lands back as a gift of the crown at the Seine. Isabella waited in the hall at Coué, while her husband made this act of homage before the Paris envoy. And the envoy's secretary noted in his account of the proceedings that she was present, but that she did not speak. She did not speak that afternoon, because there was no phrase available that would have made the situation better. Her husband's estates were in royal hands. They were restored to him, which was better than their being confiscated. The submission was the practical course, and he had chosen it, and she understood the necessity as well as anyone in the audience. She also understood that necessity and desire were not the same word, and that the interval between what had been desired and what had been done would sit at Coué for a long span after the ambassador had ridden back north. She kept her face in the manner of Alice of Courtenay. The fire burned in its ordinary way. The audience went about its business. Outside, on the roads of Poitou and Saintonge, the map was being redrawn. The Capetian throne was pressing its advantage. The Angevin throne, which was to say, the advisers of the young Plantagenet king, was watching the loss of its paternal position on the continent with a mixture of outrage and impotence that would require 2 decades to turn into a plan of recovery. Between the two thrones, the lords of the seaward marches managed their lands and their loyalties in the old way, watching, writing, dispatches, making quiet alliances and careful submissions, holding the harvest in and the highways in repair, and waiting to see which side would eventually prove the stronger. Isabella watched the same roads the other lords watched, from her mother's old writing room, and she sent the same careful dispatches, and she waited. She was 40 by the year of Blanche's steady regency. She was the parent of 5 sons and daughters, scattered across the northern realm, and of 8 or 9 underfoot in the halls of her Aquitanian home. She had 2 matrices for 2 families and 2 sets of loyalties, and she held them in the balance with the same steady hands that had once carried thin waxen tapers to a small altar image when she was a girl of 6. With her own mother poised at her shoulder to make sure she carried them level. In the course of the following decade, there came occasions when Isabella and her husband were required by the forms of their Capetian vassalage to attend the assemblies at Paris. That seat had, since the death of the 8th Capetian, been the young Louis IX, who would be given in time the additional title of saint, but who in the years of these assemblies was a sovereign of 20 or 22, deeply pious, deeply serious, ruled in many of the practical questions of government by the formidable intelligence of his parent, Blanche of Castile, who had served as regent during his minority, and who continued to be the dominant mind in the Paris government long after her son was old enough to hold his own opinions. The Capetian seat of Blanche and the young Saint King was of a different temper from that of Philip, and very different from John's. It was a royal seat in which the devotion of the sovereign set the tone, in which the Mass was heard with genuine attention, in which the poor were admitted to the king's table on certain feast days, in which the administration of justice was treated with a seriousness that the chroniclers found remarkable. It was also a chamber in which the precedence of the leading families was maintained with the precision that the Capetian crown had always maintained, and in which the place given to a visiting lady at a ceremonial occasion was a matter of careful and meaningful decision-making by the officials who arranged these things. Isabella and Hugh attended the Paris Assembly for the first significant occasion in the mid-decade of the Saint King's early reign. The exact year is uncertain, when the young sovereign held a wide gathering of his vassals and their wives to confirm the peace of the seaward country and to receive the various homages that had been delayed during the reorganization of the Aquitanian lands. The gathering was held in the tall royal audience hall, hung with the blue and gold of the Capetian crown, embroidered lilies on every surface, yet the kind of ceremonial deployment that the Hors-de-France tradition had brought to a pitch of refinement that made other gatherings look provisional. Isabella was, by birth, by title, and by the blood of the sixth capet that ran in her through her mother Alice of Courtenay, a woman of considerable standing at any Capetian gathering. She had been consort across the sea. She was countess in her own right. Her eldest son wore the Angevin crown. Her husband was Count of La Marche and lord of his Lusignan castles. The sum of these identities was a claim to a position at the high table of the assembly that was commensurate with her rank. The position she was given was not that position. The seat offered to her in the tall audience space was below a younger noblewoman of a lesser honour, a lady whose lands were smaller, whose title was newer, whose bloodline was less complex. The placement had been made, the officials explained when the question was raised, in accordance with the current precedents of the royal administration, which rated the current lords by their current standing in the Capetian system of vassalage, rather than by the full weight of their accumulated titles. She, as the wife of a vassal of the crown at Paris, ranked as a vassal's wife. The fact that she was also the widow of a monarch and the mother of one was, in the formal language of precedence, not relevant to the sitting position in the chamber. Blanche of Castile was present when this arrangement was presented to Isabella. She was seated at the high table beside her son. She did not rise when Isabella entered the audience space. A senior consort rising for a lesser one was not required by the forms of that assembly. The protocol was clear on this, but it was a thing that a generous host could choose to do, and the choice not to do it was as deliberate as any choice of precedence in a chamber full of people who understood exactly what these gestures meant. Isabella understood. She took her seat in the place she had been given, in the lower part of the chamber, with her face in the manner of Alice of Courtenay. She ate the food that was set before her and drank the wine and spoke when spoken to. And she did not let the face alter. She stayed for the length of the assembly. She rode back to her honour. She told Hugh, in the plain and economical way she told him things, what had happened in the audience. Hugh, who had been in a different part of the gathering for the military portion and had not seen the seating arrangement being made, listened. He was not a man of Alice of Courtenay's school of self-control, and what he said in response to his wife's account has not been preserved, but it was understood in the households of her honour and Couhay, in the months that followed, that the two of them had not come away from the royal assembly with any warmth for the seat that had made the placements. The cold of that reception sat at Couhay and in her upstairs room in the Charente for the remainder of that decade. And it sat alongside a set of other coldnesses that had been accumulating for the better part of 10 years. The Capetian administration of the Poitou territories had not been gentle. The officials who collected the revenues of the crown at Paris in Poitou were the royal reeves of a centralizing monarchy that was extending its apparatus of government into the Poitou-side territories in ways that the traditional lords of those honours found encroaching and expensive. There were disputes about toll roads. There were disputes about which tribunals had jurisdiction over which cases. There were disputes about the assessment of military service and about which obligations belonged to the Angevin side of a dual vassal service and which to the Capetian. And above all, there was the question of the rich revenues of Poitou, which the Capetian throne was directing into the royal treasury rather than back into the local coffers in the way that the older lords of the outlying territories had expected such revenues to flow. The grievances needed a leader with the leverage to make them into an action. Isabella had been waiting, with the patience of a woman who had been trained in patience since childhood, for the moment when all the pieces of a plan were in the right positions. By the year before her son's expedition, the young king over the water was on the throne, and was old enough and ambitious enough to want to recover his father's position on the continent. The seaward lords were ready to move. The Capetian ruler was young and confident, and perhaps not fully attended to the possibility that the settled Poitou territory could be unsettled again. And Isabella was 53 years old, and had been watching the ground shift under her feet for 4 decades, and knew which stones would hold. The alliance was made through letters. Isabella wrote to her son across the sea. The young king's council began to prepare an expedition. The Aquitanian lords joined the alliance in the way that lords of the contested territory always join alliances carefully, with their options open. Watching the two powers on either side and committing when they thought the weight had shifted far enough in one direction to make commitments safe. Hugh X, who had been among the most aggrieved of the local lords, was the centre of the alliance on the mainland side. Isabella was its architect, in the sense that she understood both the Angevin and the Capetian sides of the calculation, and could write with equal fluency to her son's counsel and to her husband's affinity. Henry led his army over the water that spring. He came with a greater force than John had brought to the same shore in those last desperate years of the empire. And he came with the stated aim of recovering the Angevin position in Poitou that his father had lost to Philip 40 years before. The seaward lords rose with him. The alliance stretched from the Charente to the Loire, a broad arc of castellanies and honours and lordships that had been, in their various ways, chafing under Capetian management for 2 decades. The campaign was the kind of campaign that looks possible in the planning and collapses in the execution. The Saint King moved faster than the Angevin expected. He came south with his brother Alphonse and a large army. And he came in the way that a sovereign who has been trained in piety and efficiency comes methodically, with the supply lines and the siege equipment in order and the command structure clear. He met the Allied army at a bridge over the Charente at a place called Taillebourg that July, and the Allied host was pushed back across the bridge and then broken at Santes, a few miles to the south. In the days that followed, the Angevin forces fell apart. The Aquitanian lords submitted one by one, as quickly as they had risen. Hugh submitted again. The son of Isabella crossed back to the Garonne, and then across the sea with his forces and his ambitions both reduced. The news of Taillebourg and Santes came to her in her upstairs chamber by a rider who arrived on a wet July road. The route was wet because the summer rains had come early that year, and the rider's cloak was dark with rain from the shoulders down, and his horse's hooves had been slipping on the clay lane south of Santes. He came into her presence and gave his news in the manner of a man who has been told to give it straight, without the false cheerfulness that messengers sometimes put around bad news to cushion it. Isabella heard him out. She dismissed him. She sat for a time by the fire, which was not built up because it was July. Just a low blaze to dry the damp that came through the stone in wet weather. She was 54. She had been at the edges of important decisions and important failures for longer than most people at the northern court had been alive. She understood what the defeat at Taillebourg meant. It meant that the Poitou side revolt was over, that the Saint King had confirmed his dominion of Poitou, that the Angevin chance for recovery had been wasted, and that she and Hugh and the allied lords would need to make their submission to the Capetian sovereign again and accept whatever terms he chose to impose. She folded her hands in her lap and sat by the fire and did not speak for some time, and then she called her chaplain and had a mass said, as she had ordered it, done on the day she heard that Normandy was lost, and went to the oratory and knelt on the hassock and stayed there for the better part of an hour. The submission was made. The Saint King was magnanimous in victory, or at least managed in the manner of a sovereign whose advisers had told him that a magnanimous peace in Poitou was worth more than a punitive one. The seaward lords were given back their lands. Hugh submitted and received his estate back. The highways. of Poitou returned to their ordinary traffic. The Capetian officials returned to their assessment of the revenues. The storm had passed, and it had left the map exactly as it had been before the storm began, with the single difference that everyone who had been on the wrong side of the crossing at Taillebourg now owed the crown at Paris, the particular obligation of a lord who has been given his land back as an act of royal grace rather than as a matter of legal right. It was 2 years after the defeat that the rumour began to circulate at the Capetian court. It said that a plot had been discovered to poison the Saint King and his brother Alphonse, and that the scheme had originated in Isabella's establishment. The whispered account was precise in its details. It named specific persons. It named specific occasions. It described a method that involved his food and his drink. And it circulated with the efficiency of a story that has been given a certain amount of assistance in its telling. Whether the plot was real, and whether Isabella had any connection to it, is a question that the surviving sources do not resolve. What the sources agree on is that the tale existed, and that it was widely believed at the Capetian seat and in the Aquitanian country, and that its effect on her position was decisive. A letter arrived from the Capetian chancery. It was formal. It was not an accusation. There was no formal legal process, no summons to court, no charge laid. It was, in the language of a chancery that was too careful to make an accusation, it could not prove, but too alarmed to say nothing. A communication that made clear to Isabella that her presence in public life was not welcome, and that the Capetian crown would be better pleased if she retired from the government of her honour to a more sheltered setting and allowed the day-to-day management of her affairs to pass to others. Isabella read it in the upstairs room above her father's old writing office. She had been reading dispatches at this desk for 27 years now, since her return south, and she had faced every kind of correspondence notes of good news and bad. Cases of legal complexity and pieces of simple goodwill, missives from her children, and papers from her enemies, and rescripts from the popes and the bishops and the sovereigns and the ordinary administrators of the Aquitanian country. This one was not the worst she had ever read. She had received dispatches telling her that Normandy was fallen and that John was dead and that Taillebourg was lost. But this new page had a particular quality to it. The quality of a door being closed without the sound of the bolt being shot, so that there was no moment at which to put a hand against the door and push back, because the door had moved so quietly that by the time it was noticed, it was already shut. She called her household to her and told them, in the plain manner she had always used, what was to happen. The management of her lands would be given to the steward, under Hugh's oversight. The writing office would continue in its work. The revenues would be distributed in the manner she had set out in a series of written instructions which she had prepared over the preceding weeks, as if she had been expecting this moment for some time. The children, her younger brood, now grown or nearly so, would be provided for as she had planned. Ima and William and Guy and Geoffrey would go across the sea to the court of their half-brother in the north, and there they would be welcomed and provided for and given the means to become what their blood entitled them to be. Alice and the girls would be married in the appropriate time to the appropriate families. She arranged the affairs of her attendants and her honour with the same systematic care she had always used for everything she managed. And when the arrangements were complete, she packed the locked coffer one last occasion and rode away. She rode through the pale limestone country of the Charente Valley, and then eastward through the orchard country and the scrub of Poitou, through the hills of the Vienne and the old road that ran along the Vienne, and then downhill through the flat meadows of the Touraine, until the towers of the Abbey of Fontevraud appeared above the tree line on their bluff. Fontevraud was the important Plantagenet abbey. It had been built in the first years of the 1100s by a wandering preacher called Robert d'Arbrissel, who had founded it as a double house for monks and nuns, with the nuns in the higher dignity and the monks in the lesser, in the arrangement that had always seemed slightly revolutionary to the more conservative of the northern monastic houses. It was an imposing foundation, with its church and its cloister, and its chapter house and its kitchen, and its famous set of Romanesque kitchens on the sunward side of the wide refectory, their conical chimneys rising above the roofline like a cluster of carved crowns. The abbey was set in meadowland beside the Vienne, and in the spring it smelled of the stream and the meadow grass, and in the autumn it smelled of the pressed grapes from the vineyards of the Touraine. The Plantagenets had used Fontevraud as their burial church. Henry II was buried there. Eleanor of Aquitaine was buried there, beside her husband, in the effigy tomb that showed her lying in the posture of a consort reading, a book open in her carved hands, with the folded veil of old age on her carved hair. Richard the Lionheart was buried there. The nave of Fontevraud was the Plantagenet family vault, and it was the vault of the empire that John had lost, and their son was trying to recover, and that Isabella had watched collapse around her from the inner apartments of half a dozen insular castles. Isabella came to Fontevraud that autumn, and was received by the abbess with the forms of courtesy due to an important lady of the Aquitanian country. She took her chambers in the guest quarters of the house, which were separate from the nuns' cloister, in the manner of a wealthy foundation that receives important visitors without making them professed. Her lodging looked out on the abbey garden, where the roses were still blooming in the September warmth, and the late butterflies were going among them. The cloister walk was visible from the window, and in the mornings the nuns' voices were audible, rising and falling in the office, coming through the walls in the way the offices had always come through walls, muffled and distant and entirely without disturbance. She did not at first take the veil. She was a guest of the house, not a nun. She heard the offices and attended the mass in the conventional hall, and walked in the garden in the afternoons, and wrote her replies at the desk in her rooms. The deep blue wax was still in its box. Her old seal was still in its case. The dispatches to Henry's council and to those who ran her lands in her name went out in the ordinary way. The locked coffer stood at the foot of the bed. Over the following months, the guest's lodging became, in its habits and its atmosphere, a little more like the quarters of a woman who does not intend to leave. The writing table was moved closer to the window. The embroidery frame was set up. The psalter was put on the prayer desk in the small oratory that the abbess had arranged for her use. The psalter that Alice of Courtenay had ordered copied in a larger hand for the Lusignan household, more than 40 years before. The hassock was placed before the sanctuary in the exact position that put the morning sun, when the morning sun came, on the hands of whoever knelt on it. She was 55 or 56. She had been a lord's daughter, a betrothed child, a consort, a widow, an heiress in her own right, a wife again, a mother of 10 children, a rebel, and a guest of an abbey. She had held, in the course of a life that had begun in the upstairs room, above her father's writing office, on the limestone escarpment, above the Charentais, her own honour, the Angevin crown, the lordship of a Lusignan house, and the ambitions of both of the leading crowns of the continent in the Aquitanian country. She was in a lodging that looked out on a garden where the roses were going over for the season, and the bells rang the hours in the way they had always rung in every religious house she had ever lived near, and the nuns' voices came through the walls in the mornings, and the locked coffer stood at the foot of the bed. She remained at Fontevraud through the winter and through the spring, and in the summer 18 months after her arrival she became ill. The illness was the kind that takes some weeks to run its course, a fever, a weakness, a gradual reduction, and it was attended by the abbey's own physician and by the abbess, who knew the management of illness as all senior abbesses knew it. That summer was a warm one, and the garden outside the window was at its height. the roses blooming again, the lavender out along the low walls of the cloister garden, the meadow beyond the abbey white with the summer's growth of grass. On the 4th of June that year, Isabella died at Fontevraud Abbey. She was 57 or 58 years old. She had been a lady of the Charente in her own right, a queen consort across the sea, and Countess of Poitou by her second marriage. And she had outlasted by 30 years the husband who had interrupted the first arrangement of her life and made the second. She had been a woman who carried 2 honours and 2 kingdoms in the same pair of hands that had once been small, enough to hold thin candles before a painted image in her mother's oratory, above the orchard valleys of her southern home. She was buried in the abbey church, as she had wished to be, in the choir among her Angevin kin. Her tomb was placed to the sequence agreed upon by the abbess and the chapter, after 2 days of quiet consultation with the sacristan, a position that acknowledged her as a queen consort of the realm across the sea, as the heiress of the Charente line, and as the wife of a lord of La Marche, and that did not require any of those 3 claims to be settled against the other 2. The effigy carved for her showed the queen in the attitude of the anointed dead, but in a fashion the workshop had not used before. The head crowned rather than veiled, the eyes shown open, the mouth in the faint composed line, the sculptors reserved for those they had lived beside. Isabella had lived beside them for 18 months. The stone was tuffo, pale and easy under the chisel, and it caught the last sun of a June afternoon through the clerestory with a warmth that the harder marbles of the older sepulchres would not accept. In the years that followed her burial, her children came in turn to Fontevraud to visit the tomb. Aymer came from over the water, where he was by now an important man at his half-brother's court. William came. Guy came from his Lusignan castle. The daughters came when their husbands' estates permitted. The king himself came once, on a journey south that passed near the abbey, and stood for a time in the choir beside his mother's effigy and the images of his grandfather and grandmother and great-uncle, and then went on south to the Garonne to manage the affairs of what was left of the Aquitanian inheritance. The sons she had sent north, the Lusignan half-brothers of the ruler on the throne beyond the water, were, in the years after her burial, among the most contentious presences in the Westminster corridors, resented by the native barons who saw them as foreign men given too much land and too much of the crown's favour, and prized by their half-brother who found in them the nearest thing he had to equals in blood and temperament. They entered the service of the crown and advised it and were granted castles and revenues, and the resentment they generated was one of the persistent strains of the long reign that followed. It was, in the end, the outcome Isabella had planned for them. She had given them what she had, the northern connection, the half-royal blood, the access to a court where they could rise. She had done for them, from a chamber in the abbey guest-house, with the locked coffer at the foot of the bed, and her old seal in its case, and the psalter with Alice's larger hand on the prayer desk. What Alice had done for her, from the room above her father's writing office, she had prepared them for the life to come, with the materials at hand, and in the manner she had been taught, and she had sent them out when the time was right. The bells at Fontevraud rang the hours over her grave in the same voices they had always rung. The roses in the cloister garden bloomed and went over and bloomed again. The masonry of the nave settled into the older courses of the foundations, as all cut blocks settle over centuries into the ground they stand on. The Charente, 2 days' ride to the south, ran clear over its pale gravel in the autumn and cloudy in the spring floods, and the oil was pressed each October. And the smell of it went out from the low barns and up through the vineyards to the limestone escarpment, and the cathedral bell rang 3 villages away on a still morning, as it had rung when there was no lady of that line, and before there was a name for her honour. Sleep well, stay warm, Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.